In a remedial school, there was a lesson. The young teacher, Catherine, was showing cards to the children, trying to involve them in the process of playing games so that they would remember the material faster and better. The kids loved her very much, always listened attentively, because she treated them with understanding and love, tried not to emphasize their illnesses. But lately she herself was not feeling well. From time to time she felt weakness, sweating, her legs became weak and she felt very nauseous. The woman realized that something was wrong with her health and should be examined properly, but there was always not enough time. Today she barely made it home, only managed to undress and fainted right in the corridor. The emergency team rushed to the call. The patient's husband reported on the phone that her spouse was unconscious and would not come round. Cases are not uncommon, and especially now it is summer. The heat is unbearable and many people feel ill. The young doctor went into the bedroom. On the bed lay a patient without feelings. Nearby her husband was fussing, waving a towel, splashing water on her, and an elderly, unpleasant lady said, "Here is a sister-in-law bad, came from work and fainted. Do something. She's always on a diet, she eats badly, she's always in trouble." The doctor was so shocked. Usually relatives are worried, but here there was some hidden dislike. He quickly and professionally treated the woman and she finally woke up. Dr. John began to examine her and question her. "Tell me, Catherine, is this the first time you fainted or have you been feeling unwell before? Do you have any chronic illnesses? What did you eat the day before?" The woman replied languidly, "But to be honest, I haven't been feeling well for weeks. I feel so weak every day. A couple of times it comes on, I feel dizzy and nauseous. And today it's been especially bad for me. I don't know what's going on. I didn't eat anything suspicious. I had lunch in the canteen, that's all. And there is no stomach upset." The doctor suddenly asked, "Tell me, how long have you had this rash on your body? It's a very suspicious symptom, and I don't like your tongue. I insist that you be hospitalized. Get everything you need, we'll take you to the hospital. You need a thorough examination. You'll take all the tests, and then we'll see." And then the husband and his mother began to object. "We are against it. What hospitalization did you help? Thank you very much. Would Catherine be better at home?" John replied sternly, "The patient, in my opinion, has the right to decide her own course of action. I'm writing that hospitalization is compulsory, and if she refuses it, then let her write a written refusal. I don't want any trouble either. I'm sure there are signs of a serious illness. It is important to detect it in time. I don't really understand your reaction. Are you indifferent to the state of health of a loved one? But for the first time I see such a thing." Catherine herself was very worried. She was still dizzy, and her weakness was severe. So she quietly replied, "I will go to the hospital. I really don't feel well. I need to find out what's wrong. Honey, my dressing gown is in the nightstand on the top shelf. Could you get it for me, please? And my papers, too." Catherine was taken away, and Mrs. Bridget whispered with son, "What are you panicking about? Why did you have to call an ambulance? She would have woken up on her own. Now what? Why do we have to go to all this trouble?" On the way to the hospital, Catherine talked to the doctor. She was worried, she asked, "Doctor, tell me honestly, what's wrong with me? Is it something terrible? Yes, you realize something, but do not tell me." John reassured her as best he could. "I won't hide it. I don't like your symptoms. But you see, I can't make any diagnosis without examination. You don't worry, everything will be found out soon. The doctors there are very good. They'll definitely cure you. I'll give you my phone number just in case. My name is John. Call me if you need anything." Catherine was admitted to the ward. A lot of tests were taken and the clinical picture was monitored. The doctor at first thought she was showing signs of a serious blood disorder. The symptoms were very similar. But when the test results came back a few days later, the diagnosis was not confirmed at all. Still, some disease tormented the woman, but what it was, no one understood. Mr. Sebastian, Catherine's doctor, was in his office when an elderly, well-groomed lady in her 60s walked in. She said hello. "Good afternoon. My name is Mrs. Bridget. I'm your patient Catherine's mother-in-law. Can you tell me how is her health? What is her diagnosis?" The doctor began to explain everything. "There is no diagnosis. We're continuing to examine her. It's true that there is something wrong with her blood, so we will do some more additional analyses for tomorrow. He ordered an ultrasound. I don't know what's causing her symptoms yet, but we'll figure it out, I'm sure. So don't worry, we'll get your daughter-in-law back on her feet. But the woman interrupted him and started an unpleasant conversation. No, you don't understand. I have a favor to ask of you. You must assure Catherine that she is terminally ill. I'm prepared to pay you well for the favor. The doctor even took off his glasses and interrogated. Are you out of your mind? Why would you do that? You mean I have to lie to the patient? Why? Either you tell me the truth or I refuse. And Mrs. Bridges sighed and began to explain. You see, I have my own little tailoring shop. We make overalls, dressing gowns, work clothes. The profits are not very big at all. And then my son Catherine brought me, saying, I love her, I'll marry her. And she is not only from a poor family, an orphan, but also a teacher with disabled people in a remedial school. The pay is pennies. I've offered her 100 times to give up this business and go to my shop. At least she could earn decent money for her family, but she wouldn't do it. And recently she inherited a house in the country from her dead grandmother. It's a rundown house, but that's not the point. The place is a protected area. The plot of land is worth a lot of money. A powerful man is interested in it. He wants to build a cottage there and a guest house too. Well, who would turn down such a chance? I've already made arrangements with the man. But Catherine spoilt it all, stubborn as a donkey. I won't sell, and that's it. It's an ancestral memorial. So I want you to scare her with a scary diagnosis. Then she won't need this plot of land, she'll give it to me herself. You're risking almost nothing. If anything, you can always say it was a mistake. The labs were mixed up. Well, it happens. Please help me. I'll thank you very much. Mr. Sebastian was very fond of money and often took bribes. And this time he thought it was a small matter. The girl's really scared. She'll believe him. And after the deal, he'd make her happy by telling her she was cured. So he, Mrs. Bridges' son, went into Catherine's room. She was feeling better after the drips, and she was ready to go home, especially as they didn't seem to have found anything wrong with her. She really didn't want to be in the ward. It was very dreary. But Mrs. Bridget waved her hands. Where do you think you're going, Catherine? You haven't been discharged. And anyway, you lie down. You don't know anything yet. My poor girl. Catherine was very much surprised. Her mother-in-law had never called her so affectionately. Then here she was being so kind. The woman asked the doctor, Can I go home now? I feel much better. I guess it's just fatigue. I promise I'll take a holiday and rest and things will get better. But Mr. Sebastian said sternly, You see, Catherine, the situation has become dramatically more complicated. We suspect a serious diagnosis, and your improvement is only temporary with therapy, and you may become ill again at home. I don't want to frighten you, but the prognosis is bleak. You have anemia. This is a very insidious and rapidly developing disease. You need constant care and treatment, but don't give up. Miracles do happen. The patient collapsed on the bed like a cripple. How? Wait, but where did this come from? I lost my parents, my grandmother, and now I'll go to the next world myself. The doctor went out silently, and the mother-in-law sat down beside him, taking her daughter-in-law's hand. Catherine, darling, don't cry. It's not over. You have to fight on. Let's sell your grandmother's house as soon as possible and use the money for expensive treatment. I believe you can do it. You're so young, me and my son. We love you so much. Shocked, Catherine looked at the woman and thought, I shouldn't have loved her. It turns out that she is a good person, so supportive. You can see that she speaks sincerely. Thank you, Mom. It's so important to me that we're a family, that we're together. But there's one thing. I can't handle all this. Where's Michael? He's never come to see me. Doesn't he love me at all? The mother-in-law spoke up. What are you talking about? Of course he does. He's so worried. He's just gone to look for the right medication. He'll drop by on his way to see you. Don't get discouraged. I'll come to you tomorrow. We'll talk about selling. What do you want? What do you want to cook? The mother-in-law left the hospital and immediately dialed her son. Michael, Where are you? Are you out with the girls again? Or have you started playing again? I come here at once. Clean yourself up, buy some flowers, and go to your wife in the hospital. I almost got her to sell the plot. I'm trying for you, you fool. But you only know how to spend money. The man started to get cranky like a child. Well, Mum, I'll see Catherine tomorrow. I don't like these hospitals, you know that. All right, I'll go for the sake of the case. You can tell me all about it at home. Listen, when Catherine sells the house, we'll get all the money, and maybe I'll divorce her right away. I just met this girl. She's great. I'm sick of hiding. And Mrs. Bridge, mind your business, not your girlfriend's. This is no time to be taking girls out. You loved your teacher so much you didn't ask about the wedding. When are you going to wise up? The house isn't sold yet. You have to act like a loving, worried husband. Do you understand? Otherwise, you'll be paying back your loans yourself. Catherine lay back against the wall and cried quietly. She remembered her childhood, her youth, and could not get it into her head that she would soon be gone completely. Catherine's mother died early. The girl was only 3, and she was taken to her grandmother, Mrs. Marion, to the village so they lived together. The village was situated in a very picturesque place, right in the depths of the forest, and surrounded by mountainous terrain on the perimeter. Catherine remembered how she and her grandmother went in rubber boots and macintoshes to pick white mushrooms and berries. And Catherine and her friend liked to climb to the top of the hills and shout at the top of their lungs, and then run down the hill. It was breathtaking inside. The view from the top was simply amazing. Nature was mesmerizing. All the children in the village were very friendly. In winter, they used to skate till exhaustion from the mountains, until all fur coat became like an ice cube, played snowballs. In summer, we bathed in the river and stole peas from the farmer's field. After the cows, they would go hang with the grown-ups. They had time for everything and were the happiest. Catherine remembered the cat Bleck, with whom they used to warm themselves on the stove in winter. The wood crackled so cozily throughout the house. It smelled of grandmother's pies. Catherine studied almost perfectly, and after receiving her diploma, her grandmother gave her all her savings and agreed with a good friend that she would take her to stay in the city and help with admission. She said, and for the road. I don't want to let you go, granddaughter. I'm attached to you, but there's nothing I can do. You have to make your own life. You've said yourself many times that you want to be a teacher like your mom. God willing. Goodbye while my Auntie Annie's taking you in. When you get in, you'll get a room in the hostel. Do your best, and don't forget about me. Call me often. Catherine cried and hugged her grandmother. She was so scared to leave her native village and part with the closest person, because her grandmother was everything to her and replaced her mother. At first it was very difficult for Catherine. Aunt Annie only looked at the girl and splashed her hands. So tomorrow we go shopping. These grandmother's blouses and old dresses you will not need here. They will laugh. And then I'll take you to the university to submit documents. And Catherine got in easily. She was given a room and she moved into a dormitory. But there was no luck. Neighbors got frivolous and arrogant, teased the girl. They didn't want to study and be friends. Not only that, they often brought gentlemen into the room. Although it was forbidden, they laughed at the girl, offered to drink or smoke, listened to music loudly. There was absolutely no opportunity to study. Catherine sat in the library until closing time, on weekends ran to Annie, just to avoid staying with obnoxious neighbors, and all dreamed that as soon as she finishes her studies and goes to work in the profession, finally we'll be able to rent a separate place. Once, in her last year of study, the neighbors brought in other suitors, 3 guys graduating from the University of Economics. They began to set the table. As always, music was on. Catherine sighed. Evening and night were gone again. Her bed stood by the window, and in the very corner, the girl took a textbook in her hands, put on headphones, and tried to read. Meanwhile, the company had become quite full. There was dancing, hugging, and passionate kissing. Only there were 2 neighbors for 3 guests. The 3rd guy became frankly bored. He also wanted to have fun with some young lady, and so the lovely friend suggested to him, "Don't get bored, Michael. Hit on our nerdy girl, just for fun. She's still innocent, unspoiled, and wild. But what if you get lucky? You're a real ladies' man." The tipsy guy sat down next to Catherine, who shrank back and looked at him unkindly. Michael struck up a conversation. "Hi, you're nice, you're pretty. Let's go on holiday with us. Why are you like an old lady, all sitting in the corner, reading? Let's have a drink, relax. We'll have an interesting time." He tried to stroke her and pull her off the bed. Catherine was very frightened and pushed the guy away forcefully, shouting, "Just touch me. I'll put you in jail for rape. Go out and have fun, and I'm not interested in this." Michael sobered up instantly. The girls laughed. "We warned you. She's wild. Look, she'll bite you." But the boy suddenly shouted at Vivienne, "You better bite your tongue. And don't touch her again, or you'll have to deal with me." The girls even took offense and sat down at the table again. And Michael said quietly, "Let's get out of here. Let's just go for a walk. Don't worry, I won't hurt you. You're not like the others, you're different. It's unusual. I want to know you better." Catherine herself did not know why she went. This guy had surprised her so much. No one had ever stood up for her like that before. She wanted to get to know him better too. They took a late night walk in the park and talked and talked. Michael said that his mother has organized a sewing shop and he will now help her with the documents and go to the procurement. Catherine also told everything about herself, that she dreams of working with children to help them overcome their complexes and teach them. And then with a sigh she added, "I can't wait to leave. Honestly, I have no strength at all. I can't stand noisy companies and I don't drink at all. I can't wait to get my own place so I don't have to hear all this noise." Michael gave her a hard look and then kissed her decisively. She didn't push away. Only her legs went straight up. And the guy promised, "Everything's going to be all right. You're my fiancée now. No one will ever hurt you again." From that day on, it was as if the neighbors were changed. No, the girls did not become friends and still disliked Catherine. But now the room was calm. She was no longer harassed, but rather ignored. Noisy parties stopped, and the girl quietly studied and all the time thanked Michael. They still dated for almost a year and then decided to get married. At that moment, the guy was really in love. He adored his Catherine and carried her in his arms. They began to live in the house of her husband with her mother-in-law. But their relations with the bride somehow immediately did not get well. They did not conflict openly, but between them there was always a chill, and Mrs. Bridget did not complain. Daughter-in-law thought that she is not their equal and that the son could have found a better bride. Catherine got a job at a remedial school. Children with various problems went there. Most often it was stuttering or underdeveloped speech. The woman corrected defects, taught kids, and sincerely loved them. As a rule, such children are very vulnerable. They are often offended by cruel peers, and they need a special approach. At first, the newlyweds lived like in a fairy tale. They were very gentle with each other, took many walks, and loved each other sincerely. But by temperament, they were completely different. Fidgety and active Michael, a darling of fate, soon bored from a quiet and measured family life. All bored, it seemed bland, and he more and more often again began to disappear at night in the company of friends, come to the tipsy. Catherine was angry, reprimanded her spouse, crying. He swore that this is the last time. A little time passed, and everything was repeated again. The mother-in-law pretended she had nothing to do with it. She pretended it was nothing to do with her. But I could see that she was happy. 6 months ago there was grief, died beloved grandmother. Catherine grieved so much, buried, as befitting a loved one. Very grieved. Mother-in-law pressured her, persuaded her to sell the house. But Catherine couldn't. It's the memory of her childhood. Everything there is painfully native. The door to the room opened. Michael came in with a bouquet of her favorite delicate chrysanthemums. He sat down next to him, hugged his wife pressed against him. Catherine was so touched. She couldn't stand it and cried on his shoulder. "Michael, how much I love you. Even though you're a big talker. How I hate to die if you only knew. It's so scary," she said. Her husband consoled her. "Well, what are you saying, my dear? You will surely get well. We'll sell your grandmother's house and cure you. And everything will be like before. Even better, don't lose heart, and everything will get better. I love you too." Catherine had calmed down a little, but with each passing day she was more and more troubled by doubts about her diagnosis. She didn't feel sick at all. The rash was gone, and so was the nausea. She couldn't believe she didn't have long to live. And the doctor was behaving strangely. He was not in a hurry to prescribe chemotherapy. She decided to call the doctor from the ambulance and ask for advice. She told him everything. John, too, confirmed her fears. I tried to check with the superintendent about your condition. He almost shoved me out of the way, saying it's none of my business. Let's do it this way. I'll try your analyses in the laboratory, and then we'll see. That same day, something else happened. Catherine heard the orderlies whispering outside her room late at night. What are we going to do? The supervisor is out of his mind. He's making us give unnecessary injections and lying to this patient that she's terminally ill. I've never seen anything like this before. She does not have any cancer, and with it, and do not lie in our department at all. The other one replied, It's none of our business. Or do you want to lose your place? They say don't poke your nose where it doesn't belong. Let the bosses sort it out for themselves. Catherine was shocked and immediately called John. She began to whisper in a frantic whisper. Please save me. They are all in collusion. I don't have any disease. I've just overheard the nurses talking. I don't know what they're injecting me with and why. I think it's my mother-in-law's plot to make me sell. I'm scared. I don't know who to trust now. John reacted instantly. Jesh, I get it. Don't panic. I'm going to help you. Wait until everyone is asleep in the ward and go quietly to the lift. Wait for me there. Don't take your things with you. I'll be there soon. Catherine was panicking and her heart was racing. She cautiously peered out into the corridor. The lights were dimly lit. There was no one at the post. Catherine tiptoed silently to the lift. It soon opened. She didn't immediately realize that the man in the gown, cap, and surgical mask from the gurney was John. He waved silently at her. Catherine stepped into the lift. Already inside, he laid her on the gurney, covered her with a sheet, and carried her outside. They managed to get away unnoticed. The man took Catherine to his home, quietly led her into his bedroom. His young son Kevin was sleeping there. The man said, Here on the sofa, make yourself comfortable. Bedding and towel will be in the cupboard. And I've got to get back to my shift or there'll be trouble. We'll talk about everything tomorrow. Kevin won't be looking for you here. You're safe? Catherine looked at him gratefully. Thank you so much, John. And I'm sorry for dragging you into my problems. I'll never forget what you've done for me. In the morning, the ward was in turmoil. The patient had disappeared without a trace. So the ward manager was furious, shouting at the nurses and orderlies. He rang Mrs. Bridget. We've had an emergency. Your daughter-in-law's missing. All her things are here, but she's nowhere to be found. Maybe she ran home? The woman excitedly replied, No. Catherine hasn't been home. Something's not right here. Why did she leave? Maybe someone blabbed to her about our conspiracy. What the hell did I pay you guys for? Find her now. She can't just disappear. I've already set up the deal and put down a deposit. Yeah, I'm finished if I don't sell this place. Mr. Williams is not a forgiving man. Where did the son find this inexperienced girl? No, I won't lose my favor. I'll get her out of the ground and find her and make her sell the damned house. John, of course, also knew what was going on in the ward, and he calmed down a little. No one talked about him, which meant no one recognized him, and everything went smoothly. After his shift, he hurried home with trepidation in his heart. It was so unusual to have Catherine waiting for him, there beside his son. He entered the flat, and from the threshold he caught the wonderful smell of cooked meat. In the kitchen, Catherine fried cutlets and entertained little Kevin, telling him some interesting stories. And the same drove the car and listened enthusiastically. Tears came to the man's eyes. He remembered the happy times when his Linda was alive. The house smelled good, too. There was real happiness here, and after she died, the flat was empty. The man could barely cope with work and his son. He had to ask his neighbors or grandmothers to come and look after the boy, as he was very often ill and almost never went to the garden. We ate half-finished, cooked food. It was difficult for John to cook. His son even refused to eat his porridge, wrinkling his nose and spitting up. Catherine heard that John had come, rejoiced, began to ask about everything. You're back. How good. I was worried. It's good that Kevin didn't let me be sad. We got along so well. I'm sorry to barge in, but your fridge was empty, so I thought I'd fix it. Dinner is brine and meatballs and coffee pudding. John hugged his son and they ate dinner. The man ate with such gusto and praised everything. Catherine, are you a magician? Even my little picky eater ate almost all of it. Your cooking is delicious. Don't worry, our escape was a success. Nobody realizes where you've disappeared to, but they say the headmistress is very angry and came around. Your mother-in-law took your things home. And most importantly, I have your blood tests. Now I finally understand the cause of your indisposition and fainting. There's a substance in your blood that's perfectly safe when taken as prescribed. But with prolonged treatment, even in a healthy person, it causes poisoning and severe allergies. Hence all your symptoms. The hospital gave you blood-purifying drugs, blood-strengthening drugs. That's what made you feel better. So your husband or your mother-in-law, or maybe they poisoned you together. That's a criminal offense. Catherine was shocked. She couldn't believe it. And then suddenly she began to put things together. It's Mrs. Bridget. That's right. I always take a thermos with me to work. I make herbal tea from my grandmother's recipe. It's very good for energy and concentration. It's very energizing. And since some time I noticed that in the morning my mother-in-law before me in the kitchen is spinning, although this has never happened before. I think she must have spiked something, and I think it's often bitter. I wrote it off a bit to a mortel. You're right, we should tell the police. I'm not going to let it go when I'm back to the family. I don't know what else my beloved husband and his mother have in store for me. But I want to talk to Michael first. I can't believe that he knew about everything and let his mother do such a thing. Catherine dialed her husband. John had already put her on the phone before, so the phone was picked up immediately. Hey, Catherine, what's the big joke? Why did you run away from the hospital? You scared us all so badly. You have a terminal diagnosis. You need treatment, so where are you anyway? An address. I'm taking you home right now. The woman could barely contain the tremor in her voice and replied firmly. Stop pretending, Michael. I know I'm not sick at all, and the fact that you and your mother have been poisoning me for a long time is terrible. Tell me, why are you doing this to me? Is it because of this plot of land? But it's my inheritance. The house I grew up in, the memory of my family. It's up to me whether I sell it or not. What right do you have to force me? And now you've decided to take me to the grave. The husband almost shouted. It's because you're stupid. And your family is now me and my mother. You live in my house and on my money. This village is almost abandoned, and it's just great good fortune that Mr. William is interested in it. The woman gasped with indignation. Not only did her spouse feel no guilt, but he had managed to blame her for everything. She began shouting into the receiver. And I did not ask you to take loans. And I have no idea where you spent this money, but certainly not on me. And I don't owe you anything. After everything that happened, I demand a divorce. I think you realize we can't live under the same roof anymore. And I'm going to the police, and I'm going to tell them everything. I want you and your mom to go to jail. She hung up the phone in frustration and cried herself to tears. Her nerves were on edge. And never before had she dared to fight back against her husband like this. Her heart was racing. John soothed the woman. Good for you, you said all the right things. You shouldn't live with a man like that. He doesn't love you. I can't imagine how it is at all to wish death on the woman you love. But I would give anything in the world to keep my wife Linda alive. Catherine shrieked and asked quietly. Forgive the immodest question, but what happened to her? John began to tell her. Linda and I lived soul to soul. She was the best. And when Kevin was born, we were the happiest people in the world. But when my son grew up, my wife decided to go to her homeland. She's from far away from the north. She wanted to take her son too, but he fell ill the day before, so we decided to leave him at home. And I can't quit my job. We're always busy. My wife got there all right, stayed with her relatives, and we called each other. Then she told me that she was on her way home from the airport. And then we got a call, an accident in the city center, many victims. I dialed my wife's number on the way, but she didn't answer. My heart felt the distress. And sure enough, my Linda was killed in that accident. I tried to pump her up for a long time. It was no use. I don't remember much at all. I could barely get her off me. I couldn't believe my wife was gone. I still blame myself for not being able to save her. Kevin was crying so hard, calling for his mom. He even started stuttering a lot. The doctors are all over the place. I even drank at first. But my mother talked me out of it, telling me that I had to pull myself together for my son's sake, that he had no one left but me. So now we live together. It's very hard, I'll admit it. Thanks to my mom, she's always there for me. The neighbor doesn't refuse, she sits with him sometimes. My schedule's crazy. I can see how Kevin misses me, how desperately he misses his mom's care, her love and affection. And that makes it even harder. He is very embarrassed about his disability. His peers make fun of him, tease him. We hardly ever go to the garden. He feels bad there, but he reaches out to you. Today was the first time I saw him calm and happy, and it warmed my heart. Catherine suggested, "If you want, I can with Kevin to study with our method. I work in a remedial school with just such children. We're learning the program. I've been watching the kid. He only stutters a lot when he's nervous, and if he's calm, he hardly stutters at all. I think we can help him." John rejoiced. I'm all for it. Thank you, I'd appreciate it if we could do it. I'm afraid he's going to have a hard time at school in a year. The next day, Catherine and John went to the police with the firm intention to bring the mother-in-law and the woman's husband to the light and make them punished. But there was no such thing. The investigator, of course, listened to everything and accepted the statement, but then suddenly said, "I see that your husband has already been to us and also wrote a statement against you." John was speechless. The flow of lies just discouraged him, he exclaimed. "They're all lying. They poisoned her for a long time to make her sell a plot in the village. They wanted to get rid of her." The investigator laughed in his face. "Well, stop talking nonsense. Do you think a piece of land in the middle of nowhere is of such interest to the owner of a sewing shop? So much so that she decided to kill her? Ridiculous, isn't it? My advice to you, take your mind off it, and instead of scheming with your mistress and spending the night at her place, go back to your family and repent. Go on living peacefully, and don't give me a hard time with your fantasies." John tugged on Catherine's sleeve and led her out of the study. He realized that Michael was ahead of them and did everything to make fools of them, and also accuse of all the deadly sins. Catherine sobbed. "It's unbelievable. Now I'm crazy for everyone. I'm also a tramp. I'm just about to be thrown out of work. My God, they've driven me to a dead end. I'm really not getting anywhere." John tried to comfort her. "Yeah, it's really getting complicated. Well, we'll get a lawyer. We'll fight. We have to keep at it. That's what they're trying to do. I'll try to talk to the superintendent again tomorrow. Maybe something will come up." Catherine was not herself all day, trying to distract herself, working hard with the baby. Surprisingly, but next to her he somehow calmed down, relaxed and practically did not stutter. And in the evening his dad came in, tired and upset. John came home and said, "Here's your sick leave, Catherine. I could barely get it to close, but I've been sacked, and that's bad news. They made it look like an expensive drug went missing from the hospital, and I got blamed. I realize who did this. I need to find a job immediately, otherwise I'll have nothing to live on." Catherine couldn't sleep all night and decided to sell her grandmother's house after all. She cried and mentally apologized to her. "I'm sorry, Grandma, but I have no other choice. I've been cornered. An innocent person has been hurt because of me. I can't do this. I have to help him and divorce Michael at last. I can't believe I misjudged him. How did I not see the scoundrel in the scoundrel? I'll always remember our cozy cottage, Grandma, even though I'll never come there again." And in the morning she called Michael and said that she agreed to sell the house in exchange for a divorce without delay and withdrawal of the police report. He cheered and told his mother, "That's it, Mom. Catherine has agreed." She finally gave in. "How well you've thought of everything. Appoint the day of the deal. Now all the money will be ours. All the stupid girl wants in exchange is a divorce and a police report. And I wasn't going to live with her anyway. My pretty girl's just waiting for it. I'll introduce you soon. My neighbor's got a great figure." Mrs. Bridget replied, "You're only thinking about girls again. Spare me the new girl for now. Let me at least live in peace. I could hardly cope with your first wife. Anyway, think about business. I can't believe this is working out. We've got to get this thing done before Catherine changes her mind." The transaction was dry and businesslike. Catherine silently signed all the documents that she was selling the house to a Mr. William. Mother-in-law sat with a stone face, even afraid to breathe and already imagined where to spend a large sum. It is necessary to expand production, buy expensive materials and equipment. No one cared about Catherine. Catherine signed the last sheet and with a challenge said to her mother-in-law, "Now your part. Where are the divorce papers? I hope I never have to run into your family again." Mrs. Bridget handed her the divorce certificate, and they went their separate ways. Catherine felt very bad. Michael had been such a coward for not coming at all. Hid, as always, behind the back of his mother, and it seemed that she betrayed the memory of his grandmother, did not protect their family home. She cried and imagined that she and her grandmother's house would be demolished, and a cottage would be built in its place. To lead, and the most offensive thing was that she didn't even get any money. She was simply deceived, slandered, and left a fool. The woman lived in John's flat, went to work, and in the evenings worked with Kevin. The man consoled her as best he could and tried not to be discouraged, although there was no reason for it at all. The superintendent told him he couldn't get a job anywhere. Some kind of vicious circle turned out. Catherine felt guilty that John could not get a job. She saw how every day he became more gloomy, silent, and sullen, always thinking about something of his own. One day he said a strange phrase. "Listen, promise me that if anything happens to me, you won't leave Kevin. I have to leave. I have to avenge us. I can't do otherwise." Catherine begged him not to do anything stupid and not to go anywhere. She realized he was desperate and capable of doing something bad. John promised her he'd be back soon, and yet he left, and she couldn't get her head round it. It was only now that she realized how much this man meant to her, how much good he had done for her, and that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. The woman ran to her neighbor and asked her to sit with the boy for a while. She rushed to her ex-husband's house. She was so afraid of being late. Her heart was racing. She was in time. John was standing nearby, waiting for Michael to come home. John clenched his fists angrily and decided that he was going to tell him everything and give him the beating he deserved. And he didn't care what happened next. Everything inside John was boiling. He couldn't bear the fact that Catherine had been deceived in such a despicable way, and that evil would go unpunished, he muttered. "For the first time since my wife died, I met the woman I loved, and once again I can't protect her." He heard the noise of a car and tensed up, preparing for a fight. Just then, gentle arms embraced him from behind. Catherine literally hung around his neck, kissing him frantically and whispering, "Don't, I beg you, he's not worth it. Let them all go to hell. We will all endure together, overcome difficulties. You'll see. I love you. I love Kevin too, and I'm going to be like a second mom to him. Just don't do anything stupid. Let him choke on the money. That's not what makes me happy. My happiness is you and your little boy. I don't need anything else." John couldn't believe his ears. Catherine had just said what he had been thinking so much about the last few days. He hugged her so tightly, pulled her against him, and whispered, "I love you too, and I won't give you to anyone. You're right. Let's probably get out of here. Tell me, how did you find me? How did you know where I was going? I was really thinking of writing a report on that bastard just out of impotence, circular bail. My hands are completely down." Catherine smiled. "I know you wanted to protect me like a real man, but this isn't the way to do it. I want you and Kevin to always be there for me. And Michael and the former mother-in-law will be punished by fate itself. I'm sure we just have to wait. In the meantime, we'll just love our son. He misses you so much. You're on holiday for the first time in a long time. I suggest we all go to the lake tomorrow. We'll grill some sausages, play some ball. I think Kevin would be happy." So they did. The little boy couldn't be happy that Daddy was home now, that he was playing with him so much, that he started laughing again. Thanks to Catherine's lessons and the love of the adults, the little boy didn't notice how he stopped stuttering. Every evening he and Catherine learned cursive words and told them to his father. The man praised the baby and was eternally grateful to Catherine. She was like a ray of light in the gloomy den, and now it was always so cozy, so bright, and it became easy on the soul. And even though Catherine's meager salary was barely enough to live on, they did not despair. John placed an ad on the internet and now provided services at home, put IVs and injections, and he kept hoping that soon he would find a suitable job. A month passed, and one day a cool Jeep pulled up in front of John's house. The family was having tea. Catherine was feeding everyone her specialty cheesecakes. The doorbell rang. John went to open it and then led his guest into the kitchen. "Catherine, it's apparently for you, Mr. William himself. He says he has important business to discuss with you. We're going to go read in the room with Kevin for a while. If you need anything, call me." "I'm glad." Catherine looked at the tall, elderly man intently and sighed. "Well, what more do you want from me? I sold you the house and lot. What else? Why did you come here to laugh in my face? It won't work that way. You'll all choke on the plot and the money. Of course, I'm very guilty in front of my grandmother because the house is very dear to me. I grew up there, and my grandmother lived there all her life, but I've been cornered. What am I explaining to you? They've demolished it already, haven't they? You know, I'm glad it turned out that way. Aren't you? If my mother-in-law hadn't stuck me with selling my inheritance, I wouldn't even be alive. And I'd never have found out my husband was a bastard. If you must know, I don't care about the money. I met my love, and now I'm living happily ever after. I have a son, and that's a lot happier than soulless notes. Get out of here. I didn't call you." The guest sighed heavily. "Wait, Catherine, don't chase me away. Let me explain everything. You see, it's not as if I didn't know anything at all. Well, no, I'm lying, of course I did. But I really wanted to build a cottage in this protected area. It's so natural there, you can go crazy. After the deal, I was busy with other things, and only yesterday I decided to go and have a look around. I was going to have the rubbish dumped and the walls broken down. But when I noticed this picture on the wall, he pulled a portrait of his grandmother out of his briefcase. Catherine remembered it well. It always hung in her bedroom. It showed her so young, so beautiful. Well, yes, that's my grandmother, Mrs. Marion. What's wrong with it? The man became agitated, asked for a glass of water, drank in a gulp, and continued. Catherine, this is my first love, you know. Your grandmother and I had such an affair. I wasn't born with money. I used to live in the country myself. I've lived all my life, seen many women. I've been married 3 times. But I remember her as I do now, with a braid below her waist and songs dancing in her eyes. You see, I've been thinking, what if you were my granddaughter? I have a grown-up son. He's in his 40s, but no grandchildren. Tell me, was your grandmother married? The woman looked dumbfounded at the visitor and pondered. Is he in his right mind? What he was saying seemed incredible. She answered absent-mindedly. No, there are no men in our family at all. My grandmother, as long as I can remember, lived her life alone. From whom did she give birth to my mother? She hid it from everyone. In the village it's not welcome, but no one ever reproached Granny for it. She was a front runner, worked long hours, even after retirement. She was very well respected. My mom also repeated her fate. She went to the city and taught school. And there she had an affair with some visiting engineer, and then the story is a beaten one. He promised to marry, and as soon as my mother got pregnant, it turned out that the gentleman had a wife and 2 children in New City, and he left safely to his family. When I was 3 years old, my mother died, and my grandmother took me to her village. That's where I grew up. She replaced my mom. You could say she was worried about me not repeating the same mistakes. That's why when I invited her to the wedding, Grandma was so happy. But I wasn't so lucky either. My husband was a scoundrel the first time, and I, like my mom, work in a remedial school teaching children with speech impediments. As for whether I'm your granddaughter or not, I don't know. But I don't believe it. It would be very sad to realize that my own grandfather has disinherited me. Mr. William coughed and lowered his eyes. Somehow he felt unbearably ashamed of himself in front of this woman, and he asked quietly, Catherine, would you mind doing a genetic test? It's very important to me. Please don't refuse. But the landlady shook her head negatively. I'm sorry, but I don't want to. You behaved so badly. You left your grandmother alone, and you didn't have a guilty conscience. I don't think so. If she never talked about you, then you did bad things to her too. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been left alone. Why didn't you get married when you were so in love? You probably ran away too. I don't want a grandfather like that. "Excuse me, I have to put my son to bed. You better go." Mr. William, as he put on his shoes, managed to pull a long brown hair out of his comb, and though he left with nothing, he decided to find out for sure. A week later, he came again to Catherine's house. Catherine again met him unkindly. "My dear fellow, something you often come to us. I told you that I do not want to see you again." But John rebuked her. "You can't do that, Catherine. You should always listen to the person you're talking to and then draw conclusions. Do sit down, Mr. William. What are you doing here? Would you like tea?" The uninvited guest silently handed Catherine the results of the examination. There could be no doubt. They were related, and she was his own granddaughter. The woman could not believe it and muttered, "Wow. I didn't believe it for a second last time, to be honest. What am I supposed to do now, Grandpa? Love you in 1 second and forgive your meanness. Tell me, why did you leave your grandmother? And I'll listen." The businessman sighed heavily and began to tell. "You're right, Catherine, you're right about everything. I have nothing to complain about. I love Mrs. Marion very much. But we were so young, riding bicycles, kissing and making out in the wheat field, making plans to be together for life. Then I got drafted. That was the night it all happened. I seduced Mrs. Marion, I'll tell you that. I couldn't resist. I promised and swore I'd marry her. And what did she do? She'll be waiting for me. At first I wrote her such letters, and she to me, and then less and less. And then she stopped altogether. And my mother wrote me that Mrs. Marion had married someone else and gone to live in another village. I felt so bad, I suffered so much, I was angry with her. I couldn't believe it, we'd made a vow. And right after the army I went to the city, as they say, so that nothing would remind me of it. There, life spun around. I was able to make a bit of a go of it. I tried my best. So I wanted to get rich and prove to myself that I was the best. Then I got married too. And only after many years, just before her death, my mother confessed that everything was wrong and that it was she who broke us up, as she didn't like her. And then she got pregnant. So my mother lied to her that I had another woman and that I'd married her while I was in the army. And poor Mrs. Marion had to move away. She was harassed in our village. I know I'm a fool myself. I wouldn't have believed anyone if I'd wanted to. And after the army, I looked for my beloved. But as they say, youth is foolish. And so we went our separate ways for the rest of our lives. Catherine, I don't expect you to fall in love with me all of a sudden. I realize time has passed. But I want to make up for my mistakes, and I'm asking you not to stop me from doing it. Firstly, I am the owner of a private clinic, and I want to offer John a good job with a decent salary, because he suffered because of all this ugly story, trying to protect you. That's what a real man does. Secondly, we'll go to the notary tomorrow and I'll cancel the deal. The house is yours by right, and I don't have the guts to flatten it after all. I'm willing to help renovate it, and I'd be happy if you'd invite me to visit someday. It's in memory of Mrs. Marion. So be it. One last thing. If you need any help at all, I'll do anything for you. However you feel about me, I'm happy to have a granddaughter of my own. Catherine blinked often and couldn't believe what she was hearing. Thank you, you grandfather. It feels so strange to say it. I'll try very hard to get our communication going. Just don't push me, okay? I need to realize all this. John thanked the businessman as well. I'm very grateful to you. Mr. William is getting desperate to find a job. The superintendent has thoroughly damaged my reputation, so I'd be happy to work for you. In fact, I'm very pleased that justice has been done and the house belongs to Catherine again. I suggest we all sit down at the table. We don't need to dwell on what happened a long time ago. We live in the here and now. We need to forgive grudges and communicate. Catherine, what are we having for lunch today? Kevin had been timidly peering out of the bedroom until then hesitant to come out. He was a little intimidated by the strange uncle. But Daddy took the child in his arms and said, Well, Kevin, let's get acquainted. This is Grandpa William. He's going to be coming to visit us now. Mr. William winked at the little boy. Hello, soldier. Come on, let's race. Whoever gets there first gets a prize. The boy was very excited. He loved all kinds of contests and riddles, and of course he won. When Mrs. Bridget received the money from the deal, Mrs. Bridget was jubilant and wanted to put it to good use. But it disappeared from the home safe as if it had vanished without a trace, and with it her own son. Michael immediately went to his mistress and bragged. "What's up, sweetheart? We're going to the casino. We're going out tonight. I feel like luck's gonna be on my side. Well, I've made a big score." He gambled like a man possessed all night till morning and lost every cent he had. Then he got drunk with grief, and then he didn't remember how he got home. He woke up to his mother slapping his cheeks and shouting, "What have you done, you idiot? You've been playing again, you swore, you promised. How are we going to pay our debts now? We've been running the scheme for months, and you blew it all in one night." Michael rubbed his temples. His head was pounding. "Oh, Mom, don't shout like that. It's nauseating. You just don't understand. I've been lucky. First it was win after win after win. And then I bet everything and lost. And I think I foreclosed on our house, too. And I remember much. Oh, it's no big deal. They just came and went. Why cry for them? You'll sell the lot. Maybe you'll have to sell the premises and the equipment, too, even with my debts. And we'll sort out the house somehow." And Mrs. Bridges scolded her son and cried and didn't know how to talk some sense into him. It was all her own fault. Indulging his whims, solving all his problems. And he remained a perpetual teenager, unable to take responsibility for his actions. And then Michael went downhill from there. Endless partying, binge drinking. He stole money from her purse and ran back to the casino. The house was taken away, and now they lived in a modest one-room flat. From acquaintances, Mrs. Bridget found out, of course, that the same businessman, Mr. William, turned out to be Catherine's own grandfather, and now she in all her care. He's got John into his private clinic, and all was well with them. She was strangled by a great envy, and also the bitter realization that it wasn't about Catherine at all, but about her wayward son. She couldn't look at his face, swollen from alcohol, and the flat was soaked with the smell of tobacco and alcohol fumes. And she begged and pleaded with her son to settle down, to stop, but all in vain. It turned out that while he was together with Catherine, he restrained himself, worked somehow to look like a man in her eyes. Now he didn't give a damn. No matter how angry Mrs. Bridget was with her son, a mother is a mother. She wanted to do something to help him out of his drinking and gambling addiction. So she took a risk, went to John's family, crying, begging forgiveness, pleading with Catherine. "I know that everything is my own fault, that I broke up the family, set you up, poisoned you, and I have no right to ask. Still, forgive me if you can and help me, please. Michael is dying, he's drinking, he's gambling. Help me to put him on compulsory treatment in your clinic. This is the last chance to save him." The woman replied dryly, "All right. I'll get my husband to fix him, but that's it. Get out of here. I can't forgive you." Michael spent a month in treatment and seemed to come to his senses. But his life was now very different. His mother deprived him of money so that he wouldn't be tempted to go back to the streets. He had to go to work as a loader in a warehouse. He was very sorry. He was very remorseful about everything he'd done. He tried to start life with a clean slate, but it was given to him very difficult because excessive care and too strong love of his mother played a cruel joke on him. He was not adapted to difficulties and was not used to be responsible for his actions. And Mrs. Bridget gave up a lot. She was tormented by chronic illness and, most importantly, unbearable longing. Only now she realized that she had wasted her life on the endless pursuit of money. Burned out at work, never made loyal friends, and destroyed her son's family. Now there was no one to talk to, and it was so depressing. Catherine never forgave him. She just cut Michael and his mother out of her life. She was still working at school, doing what she loved and expecting John's baby. They often traveled to the village now, to her grandmother's cottage. There was a special atmosphere of kindness and warmth. Catherine and John stoked the cooker, picked fragrant apples from grandmother's garden, made jam. And little Kevin, just as she had once done as a child, carried down the mountain, laughing with delight. The woman recalled funny episodes of her carefree, happy childhood and rested her soul here. And Mr. William was proud of his granddaughter and looked forward to his great-grandchildren. He visited the grave of his beloved Mrs. Marion, long sat on the bench and thanked her for meeting Catherine. He was sure it was she who would help them find each other. His present wife and son warmly welcomed the new kinswoman. So often they met and socialized. Now they were one big and friendly family. Barbara worked as an editor at a publishing house. On another Thursday, just before lunchtime, her smartphone started ringing. On the screen, she saw the words "Mom." Although calls during work were not a frequent occurrence, Barbara didn't expect anything bad. She figured her mom just missed her or wanted advice on clothing choices. Barbara answered the phone. As soon as she heard her mom's voice, she immediately knew something was wrong. The voice was strange, muffled. "Barbara, honey, don't worry, please," Mom said. "I'm at the hospital right now." "Mommy, what happened? What hospital are you in? What do the doctors say? What do you need to bring? What's the room number?" Barbara asked her questions. "Barbara, please don't worry," the voice answered. "It's just like in the movie. I slipped and fell and was passed out. But I'm fine." Gabriella, a neighbor, was walking by. She helped me and supported me while we waited for the ambulance. "The doctor said I'd be fine, but I'd be in the hospital for a while." "Mom, why didn't you tell me before?" "Mom, why didn't you tell me? I would have rushed to help." "I didn't want to interrupt you in the middle of the day." "Mom, but tonight 4 to 7 p.m. is visiting hours. I was afraid if you went home first, then to the pharmacy, you might not make it. Please write down what you need to bring. The main things are a policy, a cell phone charger, and non-carbonated water. For some reason, I'm very thirsty." Her mother sighed, and Barbara imagined her face contorted with pain. She hurried to end the conversation by asking for the number of the hospital and the room. Barbara reread the list of things her mother had dictated to her. Yes, Barbara had peed chicken broth in it and used wet wipes. And on wobbly legs, she went to ask her boss, Jack. "Please allow me to leave early today, for personal reasons. My mom's in the hospital," Barbara said. The boss, a friend of Barbara's husband's from his student days, expressed polite words of sympathy. When he learned which hospital the subordinate's mother was in, he cheered her up and asked, "But the doctors at our regional clinic are good. Maybe the atmosphere is not too luxurious, but the equipment and staff are top-notch. I've been in this hospital several times. I was discharged as good as new. So you're going to be fine. By the way, are you driving today, or is Matthew driving? Maybe Eden can give you a ride in the car." Barbara was touched by her boss's concern and decided that she was in no position to refuse. "Thank you, Jack. That would be very helpful. I'm not keeping the driver long. I just need to get to my mom's house, that's all. I won't keep Eden any longer. I'll get my things there and then call a cab. Thank you." The manager wished Barbara success and promised, "Come out in 15 minutes to the main entrance. I'll tell Eden to wait for you at your mother's house and give you a ride to your family home. He's coming back for me anyway. Is your house on the way?" Thanking her sensitive boss again, Barbara went to turn off her computer and clean up her workplace. She took the contract with her so that she wouldn't let the whole team down and complete the necessary work by the next morning. The woman badly perceived the meaning of the jokes with which the driver tried to entertain her. But even she was grateful that the flow of his speeches made her at least react somehow and prevented her from sinking into anxious thoughts. Following the list, ticking off each recorded item with a check mark, Barbara packed up her mother's apartment, watering her favorite flowers. She shut off the gas and water just in case, checked to make sure there were no perishables in the refrigerator, picked up the trash to throw out. Only then did Barbara go downstairs and set off with her driver, Eden. Not far from Barbara and Matthew's house was a supermarket with a pharmacy department inside. The woman decided to stop there on the way, asking Eden to pull over near the container yard. She threw out the garbage she had collected and rushed to get her groceries. Moving almost on autopilot, Barbara bought everything she needed and was soon preparing dinner for her husband and broth for her mother at the same time. While the food was boiling and baking, she called Matthew and explained the situation. "Matthew, Mom is in the hospital. I'm going to go see her. I'm not sure how long she'll be there. Dinner will be on the stove." My husband replied, "I'm aware of that. Jack told me you needed support. You wait for me, I'll try to get there early, and we'll go to the hospital together. See if there's anything else you need, and I'll be there for you." Matthew didn't let his wife down and took her and the 2 bags she had packed and drove her to the hospital. Barbara managed to persuade the nurse taking the bags to let her see her mother and the doctor, who was fortunately there. Matthew remained waiting for his wife in the lobby, but gave her kind words and wishes for a speedy recovery. Audrey tried to smile when she saw Barbara enter the room, but it was noticeable that she was uncomfortable and frightened. Barbara said a soft but distinctive hello to everyone in the room and made her way to her mother's bedside. A weight was suspended from the unfortunate woman's right leg. Her lips, swollen almost to the point of bleeding, were a clear indication that the victim of the ice had been in great pain. Barbara listened to her mother's account of her accident and, trying not to cry, began to put everything she had brought into the nightstand. The phone was immediately put on charge. She gave her mother tea with jam, broth, made her eat a few spoonfuls of raw, grated carrots. The internet says that such a salad in the first days after injury the best vitamin remedy. Then I'll give you some sauerkraut. It's good for you, too, Barbara said. Oh, don't worry, my daughter. You should probably go home, Matthew. He's probably worried you're gone, Audrey said. Barbara explained that her husband had rushed home when he heard what had happened so she wouldn't have to take a cab, but he hadn't been missed. But he said hello, as if he'd just been waiting for that line. The woman lying in the next bed became active. Sanitarians, nurses here are rude, boorish women. And you interfere in the conversation. It is impossible to call them neither day nor night. They serve teas, make fun of doctors, give chocolates. Even giving them money is useless. They're not even doing their job properly anyway. Barbara kept silent, and having found out from her mother the name and patronymic of her attending doctor, went in search of him. The restless neighbor also made a good point. In the residence room, if not, then in the dressing room, look there, probably with someone cooing keen. Thanking the nagging woman dryly, Barbara went out into the corridor. The nurses in the trauma room, accustomed to all sorts of relatives, tears and hysterics, looked at the visitor, asking how to find a doctor with a mixture of irritation and fatigue. But one of them, who held herself like a superior, answered thoroughly. Patrick is now in the superintendent's office, the penultimate door at that end of the corridor. Wait there. Or you can sit on the bench near the residence room. Barbara waited for the doctor, and he recognized her as Audrey's daughter. He invited her into the office, showing her the picture on the computer screen. If I may say so, your mother's fracture was a success, Patrick explained. In general, there are 2 treatment options. The man began to explain the nuances of each option, then asked, "Which one did you decide on?" Barbara looked the doctor in the eyes, but did not answer, but asked a counter question. Say, Patrick, for example, if a patient with the same fracture as my mom had a loved one, what would you recommend? Smiling, the doctor replied briefly. A similar case was with my aunt. Our superintendent performed a similar operation on her a year ago, and as she now leads an active life, even works at the cottage, so I cannot keep up with her. The woman clarified all the details of the upcoming surgery, wrote down what else should be brought for the postoperative period, and having said goodbye to the doctor, left the office. Barbara had to announce to her mother that the surgery was scheduled for the next day, and she presented the news as lightly as possible, trying not to disturb her mother. Tomorrow I'll go and meet you. You'll be fine after the operation, don't worry. Barbara, what about your job? The boss is probably going to be mad, Audrey asked. Don't worry about that. I'll do all the work and I won't let you or the chief down. With the surgery, the long road to getting Audrey walking again had just begun. For 2 weeks, Barbara visited her mother almost daily to feed and nurse her. The woman tried to object and repeatedly stated, "Barbara, you take care of yourself. Don't come to see me so often. The food here is not bad, and I have no appetite. Where would it come from if my energy is not used for anything?" But Audrey couldn't change her daughter's mind. When the day of discharge arrived, Barbara went to the doctor's office for recommendations. Patrick was cautious and warned. "Your mom is a very energetic lady, but I've made my point, and I'll make it to you again. I wouldn't be overly optimistic if I were you. But there's no need to despair, although you can't use your injured limb for full weight bearing. Crutches are your mom's best friend for the next month. And then you have to be careful too. Of course it is necessary to move, but carefully. Prophylactic treatments are indicated to prevent bed sores. In 6 weeks, I'll be waiting for a follow-up X-ray. We'll see what stage of fusion the bone will be in. That's pretty much it. Barbara asked. Maybe some vitamins for Mom to take? Patrick shrugged. Well, in principle you could, but in general you should be told about the rehabilitation plan at the polyclinic where you live. Barbara called a special cab specializing in the transportation of people with limited mobility, and after a heroic trek through the streets, Audrey was finally in her apartment. Barbara faced a new problem. Audrey's physical condition still left much to be desired. Even a simple trip to the restroom or kitchen could result in a new injury. At first, Barbara came to Audrey's house twice a day, and closer to the New Year's holidays, she was practically exhausted. The traffic jams were so time-consuming that there were only a few hours left for sleep. Barbara turned to her husband. Matthew, let's let Mom stay with us for a while. At least I won't have to go back and forth between apartments. The man answered grimly, and after a quick pause, Barbara, I feel wonderful about your mother. Audrey is a wonderful woman, but I'm sorry, but I'm going to be blunt, we have nowhere to put her here. I mean, it's a studio apartment. It's a big room, but there's only one room. When I talked you into taking out a mortgage, I didn't get any sympathy. Both you and your mom were against it. Matthew, there's got to be some kind of a screen. It'd be like having 2 rooms. Look, but Audrey would be the first thing that would be uncomfortable. I play computer games loudly. I listen to music all night. Besides, you should ask her if she'd be willing to move. I'm 100% sure she'll say no. Your mom is very tactful and wise and realizes that the further away she lives, the better her relationship with her son-in-law will be. Matthew turns out to be right. Audrey, having barely heard the idea of moving into her son-in-law and daughter's apartment, only exclaimed indignantly, "There can't even be a conversation. At home and the walls help. I will not go to your place, especially there, and it will be inconvenient to be sick in peace." Barbara obeyed her mother's will. She didn't want to argue with her husband. She continued to waste time standing in traffic and left the place of a lawyer in Jack's firm. With the permission of her boss, Barbara transferred to a half-time position and was very glad that the manager was able to meet her needs. She prepared the contracts during the visit and trained her smart girl, and diligently performed all the duties that did not require constant presence in the office. The rehab, however, took a lot more money than the woman had realized. Sometimes she shared with her husband her indignation at the fact that pharmacies changed prices at will and tried to sell the most expensive version of a drug. And then Matthew would grumble. "Look, Barbara, your mother must have some free medication." The woman tried not to answer. After all, the family budget did not suffer, and money from her husband for almost 6 months since the fateful news of her mother's troubles, she did not ask. Barbara had generally tried to handle the situation on her own, without Matthew's interference. The weather was changing. Barbara's schedule remained almost unchanged by the tradition that had formed. In the morning she would make her husband breakfast and, if she had time, make preparations for lunch and dinner. Then, after putting some of the breakfast in containers, she would rush to her mother's house, stopping at stores and pharmacies along the way. Taking care of her, keeping her spirits up, and helping her move around the apartment took a lot of time. Barbara would then run to the office and rush home by evening in case of any emergencies. Her neighbor, the same Gabriella who had helped her wait for the ambulance, had the key to her mother's apartment. She would sometimes drop by to watch TV and gossip together, so Audrey couldn't be called abandoned. But Barbara was desperate to get her mom back on her feet, and not just because she had to spend a lot of time traveling between very distant parts of the city every day, without weekends and holidays. It was just that Mom was the closest person to her. She had, in fact, given Barbara life twice. The first time was on her birthday 38 years ago, but more importantly later when a terrible tragedy struck Barbara in a terrible avalanche. It was her mother who was there for her in those black days, helped her to move around when her legs almost collapsed due to nervousness, forced her to drink and eat, then by persuasion, then by force. Abandoning her monetary and not dusty work, my mother sold the apartment in their hometown and, almost as a huge and clumsy cule, moved it 2,000 kilometers away from the place where everything Barbara reminded her of her inhuman grief. It was Audrey who had forced her to take a job where it was almost impossible to be alone with her sad thoughts, where she had to look stylish and trim. Barbara did not consider her help to her mother as self-sacrifice and, despite her fatigue, tried to surround her husband with care. Moreover, the 10-year wedding anniversary was approaching, and the woman wanted to organize a touching congratulation and a pleasant surprise for patient Matthew. She made a preliminary version of the menu in advance. She found a confectionery where orders were made on individual designs and agreed to prepare an unusual figurative cake for her husband. "I love his sweets," Barbara said. The holiday was approaching, but shortly before it arrived, Matthew, during his morning breakfast, warned, "Sorry, Barbara, but I need a car for a few days. I have to go to the branch office in the neighboring region because something seems to be going on there with the branch manager's reports. Profits are down by leaps and bounds. Although in other divisions everything is even, and in some places even growth is observed. Of course, I'll try to make a quick trip, but airplanes are unlikely to fly in those parts, and I don't feel like taking the train. Can you manage without a car?" Although Barbara herself was counting on the faithful family horse, she didn't argue. After all, her husband really needed the car more. She smiled. "I'll manage, of course." Matthew thanked her politely for breakfast and promised, "Nothing, we'll buy you an iron horse a little later. The situation at work will normalize, and you'll choose a model." Running out of the house, the man kissed his wife on the cheek, winked and said, "Don't worry, I remember our wedding anniversary. I'll try to be there Friday night." Taking advantage of her husband's absence, Barbara moved to her mother's house for a while so as not to waste time on the road. During these few days, she had time to do a general cleaning, and the apartment was somehow especially fresh in spring. Only on the eve of the holiday, Barbara had to return home. To bring to the office, she urgently needed a diploma. However, it was even better, because she had to clean up the house and prepare some of Matthew's favorite salads. In the morning, the woman took the holiday treats that had been put aside in separate containers and rushed to her mother's house. She habitually gave her a massage, helped her walk around her room, and even after waiting for the elevator repairs to be completed, finally took her mother outside so she could rejoice in the nice weather and enjoy the feeling of life returning to the way it was before the injury. After a short walk, Audrey and Barbara had lunch, and the daughter began to apologize. "Mommy, you'll have to excuse me, please. I'm going to leave early today. I want to surprise Matthew. Turn off the TV when you get bored. Your cell phone's charged. Call me if you need anything, okay?" "Run, Barbara. Happy holidays and cheers." Wow, 10 years together. She kissed her mom, and Barbara ran along the route she'd planned. Spring, which had long ago entered its rights and was rapidly approaching summer, gave soft warmth, and the sweet and tart aroma of blossoming lilac set the mood for the most romantic mood. Contrary to popular belief that marriage in May portended trouble, she did not have to suffer in her second marriage. On the contrary, Matthew was for a woman a safe haven. There were no violent passions between them, but there was mutual sympathy and respect. Barbara appreciated her husband for the fact that he did not pry into her soul, did not pester her with jealousy and suspicion, did not demand to give birth to an heir or heiress. It was only when he announced his serious intentions that Barbara warned him directly and honestly that children were not part of her plans. The man was not frightened by this statement. A few years after the wedding, Matthew asked if she had changed her mind about the child, but having heard a categorical no, did not begin to find out the reasons and did not raise this topic again. The man was a good partner, and of course she loved him in her own way, with all the strength her wounded heart was capable of. Following the list she'd made the day before, Barbara bought drinks, picked up the calamari Matthew adored, and so she bought little things: a crusty baguette, fresh green salad, fruit. The 2 large shopping bags that Barbara had thoughtfully brought with her were gradually filling up. Having hung them on both shoulders, she ran into the pastry shop where she had ordered a cake. Now it was time to go home. As she approached the driveway, Barbara looked hopefully at the family parking space and breathed a sigh of relief there was no car, so she would have time to set the table, hang the balloons, and dress up before her husband returned. Praising herself mentally for the handy bags, thanks to which one hand was free, the woman hurriedly opened the door and finally found herself in the family nest. Placing the box with the cake on the banquet, Barbara suddenly froze with surprise. The familiar hum of a residential apartment building was brazenly interfered with by a foreign sound coming from the kitchen. Strangely, there were no foreign shoes on the mat. There were no foreign things visible, but the clatter of dishes came to her quite clearly, as if someone had moved a massive plate or a bulky mug. Matthew and Barbara kept no pets. All they wanted was a cute dog. An unfortunate accident with their mom had tweaked that plan. It probably would have been much smarter to go out to the playground, close the door, and call her husband. But from fatigue, Barbara didn't act as safety dictated. Automatically pulling her sneakers off her feet, and with her bag squarely on her shoulders, the woman walked into the kitchen and nearly collapsed with surprise, tucking one leg under her. On a chair sat a boy of about 6 years of age. The unknown little guest was completely engrossed in his meal. On the table in front of him was Matthew's huge mug, a bottle of water, and a large deep plate into which Barbara had assembled the puffed salad from the evening before, so that it would have time to soak. A spoon sticking out from the edge clearly indicated that the dish had already been unceremoniously sampled. The child bit into the stick of cheese and smoked sausage with gusto, and the woman's heart clenched as the memories came flooding back. It was too painful to act rationally. For a few seconds, Barbara even thought she was hallucinating because of overwork or some other reason. However, the sight, the sound, the image, and even the aroma of the sausage were too realistic. The engrossed boy broke away from his tasty pastime only after Barbara, in a voice a little hoarse from nervous shock, caught his attention with a question. "Hello, who are you? And what are you doing here?" The boy jumped up from his chair and, without letting go of the sausage, reported. "My name is Roger. Uncle Matthew brought me here. Told him to wait here. Said I could eat whatever I wanted. So I'm eating. It's good sausage, but it's very salty." Barbara had no idea that the man the boy called Uncle Matthew wasn't her husband. There was no such incredible coincidence as in a traditional New Year's Eve movie, when the hero didn't realize he'd opened someone else's apartment with his own keys, and was completely unconcerned by the typical furnishings of a standard apartment. Barbara could safely vouch for the fact that it wasn't easy to find even a closely similar design as in her and her husband's place. Surely there must be a logical explanation for the boy's appearance in the kitchen, the woman thought. She herself, having married Matthew, had become Davies, and Roger's last name meant absolutely nothing to her. Her husband was the only child of his parents, but he had cousins, as far as Barbara knew. Except they hadn't been invited to the modest wedding, and she didn't know them by face or surname. So it was quite possible that the Roger sitting before her was the child of one of her husband's cousins. But why had he, without even warning, suddenly brought this boy to their apartment? Shaken out of her psychological equilibrium, Barbara couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she hadn't even had time to think of any plausible version when Matthew called. Coming out of her daze, Barbara finally took the bags off her shoulders and took the call. The man began to speak quickly, literally not letting his wife get a word in edgewise. "Love, you and I just missed each other by a little bit. I've just left Audrey's apartment, and I'll be there in 20 minutes to explain everything to you. Set the table." Okay, the confused woman cheered up a little and replied briefly. She felt Roger's gaze on her very clearly, but she could not find the strength to look him in the eye. The woman brought from the hallway her new slippers, just recently purchased in anticipation of the approaching summer season, and suggested, "Roger, you have sneakers. It's hot at home. Keep your flip-flops. Put them on. It will be more comfortable and convenient." The child silently obeyed. To defuse the situation and occupy the boy thrown to her, but at the same time to avoid having to talk to him a lot, Barbara asked, "Roger, do you know how to inflate balloons?" The boy nodded. The woman quickly went to the room and brought the child a whole package of balloons. Then, obeying some impulse, she licked the tips through which Roger was to inflate the balloons and handed them to him, asking, "Don't inflate too much. When you get tired, rest, and I'll help you tie them. Deal?" The child nodded dutifully and, without feeling any embarrassment, asked, "And what's your name?" "Barbara." There was silence in the kitchen. The boy, thinking about something, was busy with the marbles. Barbara kept an eye on her guest and began to sort through the bags, prepare what was planned, and gradually set the table. She put the cake in the refrigerator and, distracted by tying the inflated balloons, felt a pinch of pain rather than irritation. She wasn't angry with her husband, but her mind was spinning incessantly with all sorts of thoughts. The woman felt the curious gaze of the little guest, but did not dare to look him in the eye. So they looked at each other, but hardly spoke to each other. Barbara did not notice how Matthew came into the kitchen with a huge bouquet of roses in his hands and a large bag. The man put the bag on the floor and handed the flowers to his wife. "Barbara, congratulations to you and myself on our holiday. I see that you and Roger have already made friends. That's wonderful. Well then, let's celebrate." The boy was visibly cheerful, and after Matthew appeared, he said modestly, "Congratulations." And when everyone sat down at the table after the inevitable fuss, he boasted loudly, "Uncle Matthew, I inflated the balloons myself and Barbara helped me tie them. That's a nice surprise we got for you." The grown man mumbled something inaudible in response, praising Roger and his wife, who hadn't even touched the food. There was tension in the apartment, and Matthew set about remedying the situation. He softly turned on the music and began to enthusiastically praise the dishes his wife had prepared. Then he made a toast to Barbara's beauty and charm. He took a box out of his pocket, handed it to her, and said, "Congratulations. I hope you like it." The woman, confused in her assumptions and thoughts about why her husband had brought a child to the apartment, only now remembered her gift. Leaving the not-too-cheerful company for a while, Barbara, clutching the unopened box in the palm of her hand, took out the hidden present. Returning to the table, she handed the package to her husband and confined herself to a parsimonious phrase, "In honor of your wedding anniversary." Matthew hastily tore the wrapping paper, marveled at the pewter mug, and began to show the gift to Roger. The woman felt uncomfortable and sank back into her thoughts. Not at all how she had envisioned the wedding anniversary celebration. She had wanted to prepare a surprise, but her husband had managed not only to surprise her, but to throw her completely off balance in the most natural way. Barbara coughed violently from surprise, choking on her mineral water, when she heard the question addressed to her. "Barbara, Roger's going to stay with us for a couple of weeks, okay?" Matthew said. Barbara was silent, not knowing what to say. Matthew tried to justify himself. "I stopped by Audrey's to pick you up on my way home. I wanted to explain everything to you, but I didn't have time. It was a surprise. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I was sure that I would pick you up at your mom's and tell you on the way that we had a guest." Matthew's monologue ended in a long silence. Barbara moved the food on her plate with her fork without looking up at her husband. He, confused, didn't know what else to say for himself. With childlike directness, Roger broke into the silence by asking, "Aunt Barbara, thank you. I've already eaten. Can I have some cake now?" The boy showed the empty plate, and with a stony face, Barbara got up from the chair and went to the refrigerator. She wanted to scream, stomp her feet, and sob. Her faith in her husband's honesty was shaken. But she knew it wouldn't make it any easier. The most likely explanation for Matthew's bringing Roger to the apartment seemed to be that he had been unfaithful. With all her being, Barbara now hated the man she had loved for 10 years as much as she knew how. Matthew, who knew his wife well, guessed from her impulsive movements that she would say what was on her mind. So he decided to take the little guest away from the table to a sitting area where he could distract himself from the upcoming serious adult conversation. "Roger, come on, I'll turn on the game console. True, my games are mostly complex, but we can find something to your taste on the internet, or cartoons if you want." "Are you allowed to eat cake there?" asked the boy. "Of course you can eat anything," Matthew said. The boy's eyes sparkled, and he trustingly followed the owner of the apartment to the cozy, soft corner. Barbara, having heard the conversation between her husband and the guest, cut a large piece of cake, carefully placed it on a plate, turned on the electric kettle, and carefully watched it boil. The click of the kettle turning off brought Barbara out of her reverie. She was making tea. The woman placed a cup of the delicious beverage, sugar and spoon, and a plate of cake on a tray, then carried it to a table near the play area of the apartment. Matthew was showing Roger a collection of computer games, but the boy, who was clearly well-mannered, broke away from the fascinating activity and thanked. "Thank you very much." Barbara nodded and turned and walked away. When Matthew came into the kitchen, he found Barbara sitting on the floor, holding a pair of children's sneakers. Tears were rolling down her cheeks. The man tried to make a joke. "Barbara, what's wrong with you?" A child with dirty shoes walked into the kitchen. "Now, robot vacuum cleaner, turn on, let him work." "It's no big deal. It's nothing. Why get upset over a little dust? Especially since it's a holiday." Barbara looked at her husband in a way that made him uncomfortable and said quietly, "Matthew, I think I've told you repeatedly that I don't want to be in the same space with the children for too long. It's beyond me. There must have been good reasons for what you did, or, as you put it, for the surprise. And you're understandable. But I'm sorry, I don't have the slightest desire to deal with any of this today. I'm going to go to my mother's and stay with her for a while." Matthew could not understand the reason for such a categorical decision of his wife, but he saw that Barbara was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, so he suggested, "Barbara, I'm really very guilty for not warning you, but I can explain everything. I think that when you hear me out, you'll realize that I couldn't have done anything differently. I'll wait until you're ready to talk." Suddenly, the woman gently put down the children's sneakers, wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and went to the door, as if she hadn't heard her husband. Matthew took his wife's hand and asked, "Barbara, wait a minute. I'll call a cab to Audrey's house so I don't have to worry about you." Barbara nodded and was soon in the cab car. She was holding her purse in her hands. The road was clear, and it took much less time to get to her mom's house than it did during peak hours. As soon as the woman opened the door, she heard, "Gabriella, come in, dear. I'm not feeling very well." Barbara closed the door behind her and went straight into her mother's bedroom. Audrey was alarmed to see her daughter. "Barbara, what are you doing back? Didn't Matthew come home? By my reckoning, your wedding anniversary celebration should be in full swing. And you're here for some reason. Daughter, what's wrong?" Barbara walked over to her mother's bed, sat down on the floor, and leaned her head against Audrey's palm and told her everything that had happened since she had come home and seen Roger there. When she had finished her story, Barbara made her suggestion. "Mom, I'm pretty sure Roger is Matthew's illegitimate son. The boy looks to be about 6 years old. So my husband cheated on me and had the nerve to show me evidence of his infidelity on our wedding anniversary." Audrey tried to reassure her daughter. "I'm sure Matthew can explain everything. I can feel that he loves you. Believe my experience, he would hardly risk his relationship with you and cheat." Barbara, however, cried without stopping. Audrey stroked her so mature but defenseless daughter, but no more words were spoken because they were all powerless. Finally, when the flow of tears dried up, Barbara silently got up from the floor and went to wash her face swollen with tears. The woman felt completely devastated. Returning to her mother's room, Barbara confessed, "I'm very tired for today, and I don't mind lying down." Audrey did not object and suggested, for example, to talk some more and have dinner. She realized that her unhappy daughter needed to rest. "Of course, Barbara, but let's get you and me something to calm you down." "Of course, Barbara. Valerian, at least. It would do you and me good." Barbara complied with her mother's request and went to bed. The nervous tension was so intense that the woman passed out and woke up when the clock read 10. She jumped up on the couch and rushed to the kitchen, where she caught Audrey's mother preparing the batter for pancakes. "Good morning, daughter. You're just in time. Are we having breakfast now?" The women made pancakes in 4 hands and, as if they were in agreement, never said a word about yesterday's situation. As Barbara was washing the dishes, Audrey asked, "Daughter, please go to the theater with Gabriella. She has 2 tickets to a very good play, great seats in the parlor. Her niece gave them to her for her birthday. They were supposed to go together. And then, as luck would have it, her niece got sick. The rest of the family can't keep Gabriella company. Some of them are called away on country plots, some are on a business trip. So the ticket's gone. It's a shame." Barbara shook her head. "Mommy, I don't want to go anywhere. I'm not in the mood." However, if Audrey had something on her mind, she knew how to insist on her own. "That's why you should go, because you're not in the mood. Art is great at switching thoughts in your head and changing emotions. Please, daughter, not for the sake of the missing ticket, but for me. I want to. Barbara had to comply with her mother's wish. However, she refused the offer to run to the hairdresser beforehand and get a new haircut. After waiting for Gabriella to take Barbara away, Audrey called her son-in-law and said in an almost commanding tone, "Matthew, Barbara won't be here until about 3 p.m. Come over, we need to talk." The man did not resist, but warned, "Audrey, I'll be there, but I don't have anyone to leave Roger with. I don't think I can find a nanny, but I wouldn't trust the boy to someone I don't know, so I can only come with him. Do you mind?" The woman sighed. "I don't mind." "Me? Great. Then Roger and I will be at your place in half an hour." 30 minutes later, Audrey, carefully reaching the door leaning on a walker, let Matthew and Roger into the apartment. The man introduced the child and the boy. Roger said a polite hello. Mistress Audrey tried not to betray her incredible excitement and hospitably invited Roger into the kitchen. "Come in. I have a TV and cakes waiting for you. Do you want cocoa or tea?" The child announced that he tastes most delicious coffee, but it is not allowed for children to drink this drink often, and he will drink tea because he is too old for cocoa. Audrey almost laughed out of surprise, but she got her emotions under control in time and, turning to Matthew, asked, "Can we give Roger some tea too?" And she was more like a treat. It's almost like coffee. The boy rejoiced. "I want to try this drink. Matthew, may I?" And Matthew said yes. As the hostess deftly prepared the treat for Roger, the man handed the boy his smartphone and explained, "I need to talk to Audrey. You, please stay here. Eat the treats, play on your phone, maybe even watch some videos on the internet for a bit." "Good, sure, where there are words. I'm perfectly capable of being unsupervised, don't worry." Observing this picture, Audrey could barely restrain herself from crying. Hiding her emotions, she slowly walked toward the room, which was old-fashionedly called the hall. Matthew followed her, eager to find out what Audrey wanted to talk to him about. The woman sat down in an armchair, and the man sat on a sofa across from it, so that the conversation could be carried on comfortably. The hostess looked at her son-in-law attentively, but he did not endure long and asked without preamble, "Audrey, will you explain to me why Barbara reacted so inadequately to Roger's appearance in our apartment? Will I admit my guilt? If anything, I did not warn her. But we're adults. Instead of having a calm conversation, she basically just ran to you. Is that normal?" The woman did not interrupt the indignant speech of her son-in-law, but his question was not in a hurry to answer, and asked a counter-question. "Before I start a difficult conversation to try to help my daughter to keep the family, I need to be sure that it makes sense. Tell me the truth, Matthew. Is Roger your illegitimate son?" The man's outrage was unparalleled. "No, of course not. I've never thought of cheating on Barbara. I love her very much, I respect her, but her attitude towards children is starting to scare me. Roger was in our apartment because of a desperate situation, but Barbara didn't even try to get along with him. Although, as you may have noticed, he is a well-mannered, bright, and charming boy." Matthew's answer calmed the worried Audrey, and taking a deep breath, as if preparing to make a parachute jump, she decided to tell her son-in-law the truth. "What is it?" "All things secret, as they say, come to light. As a husband, you have the right to know why my daughter avoids contact with children. I think I have the right to tell you her story, which at first seemed like a happy fairy tale, and then turned into a terrible nightmare that destroyed the usual life. Barbara grew up a wonderful and clever girl, and was a real joy for me and my husband. We had no problem to arrange her to study in one of the best gymnasiums in our city. The income of our family and the positions held by me and my husband allowed Barbara to be her own among the same, as they say, golden youth. However, the gymnasium had a very strong teaching staff, and grades were not for sale, as you might think. Children were skillfully interested in learning, and our Barbara was one of the best students in the class. She was even made a tutor for her desk mate Frank. The boy was from a very good family, quite influential in our town. His dad was a district attorney, and his mom was in the same department in the last position. In general, they lived better than our family, but they didn't hinder the development of their son's friendship with Barbara. They welcomed her wholeheartedly. They did not talk to me and my husband through the lip, but quite kindly. When Barbara was in 10th grade, her father died suddenly. A blood clot had broken, according to the autopsy. It was Frank's family that supported Barbara and me after this loss. I still thank them for that, because I was in such a state that I almost went to my husband. So of course I didn't mind at all when Barbara decided to marry Frank. So what if they were just over 18 at the time? Obviously, you can't stand in the way of real feelings. Frank's parents didn't mind either and were even happy to have my daughter as part of their family. A year after the wedding, Barbara and Frank had twins, 2 boys, Adam and Henry. Healthy, cheerful, and strong, they grew up and made us all happy. Barbara couldn't get enough of her babies. You know, Matthew, she used to tell me that she was walking, rolling the stroller in front of her, and her heart was ready to jump out of her chest every now and then. Of course, I helped whenever I could. My mother-in-law repeatedly suggested that Barbara hire a reliable nanny, but my daughter refused every time and mostly managed on her own. God knows what it cost her, but she did not give up her university studies, and even without a sabbatical leave managed to do without. And her father-in-law put her in a prestigious and well-paid job in such a position that the working day was strictly rationed. There was a social package and other benefits. He had the opportunity, of course. And he was not ashamed to patronize his daughter-in-law. Barbara was smart. When the boys were 6, my daughter became pregnant again. Frank welcomed the news with joy, and why should he? It was a wonderful family relationship. As far as I know, there's never been a fight between them. It was like the 2 halves were lucky enough to be united as a whole. I know a lot of people were jealous, and some of the ladies tried to have an affair with Frank. But he didn't want anyone but my daughter. Everything was so perfect, I never thought it would all come crashing down overnight because of a terrible tragedy. Barbara, of course, had to see a doctor. And Frank volunteered to pick up his sons from daycare. By a ridiculous coincidence, his car broke down that day, and he decided not to call a cab, but to take the children home through the park. The weather was beautiful, and although the rides were not yet open, there was a pizzeria at the exit of the park that the boys were eager to go to. Frank met a buddy on the way, and while he was talking to him, the kids scattered. They ran out onto the lake, but the march ice was treacherously thin. My grandchildren, as witnesses later told me, didn't even have time to scream. They went under in a flash. Frank and his buddy rushed to the pond. But no luck. Only the divers who arrived at the scene of the tragedy managed to catch the boys. Frank later tried to justify himself, like a clockwork, constantly repeating that he was distracted only for a few seconds. What's the use? Our boys had drowned. There was no fixing it. My son-in-law was the first to tell me this bitter news because he was afraid for Barbara, and for good reason. I went to the private clinic where I knew Barbara was at the time. My heart told me that it was better to have doctors close by when the worst of grief came upon my daughter. Seeing me in the hallway, Barbara must have realized everything by the look on my face. She was hysterical after hearing the news. Barbara could not be calmed down, even with a large dose of medication. She never went home that night. She ended up in the hospital with a nervous breakdown. My daughter was worried about her dead sons and was unable to save the baby that was developing under her heart. The doctors didn't even consider him a baby yet, and she had already lost him. At Adam and Henry's funeral, Barbara stood like a stone statue. No tears, no emotion. Pale as death. Especially frightening was the emptiness in her eyes. Frank was no less worried. In his 25 years, he tried to take Barbara's hand for support, but she shied away from him like a leper. She never again crossed the threshold of the apartment where she lived with her husband and sons. How many times Frank had tried to talk to her, I couldn't count. Only it never worked. Barbara just cut her husband out of her life. Frank's mom came to us when she realized my daughter didn't want to see or hear from her husband. She was on her knees, begging me to forgive her son, saying he wasn't himself. I shared my sad thoughts that he was on the verge of leaving this world. But Barbara didn't react. She could never forgive her husband for the death of her sons. Frank could not forgive himself either. Indeed, he had turned from a blossoming man into a pale semblance of his former self. Barbara predictably quit her job, seemingly of her own accord. But in fact, everyone realized that she simply could not be under everyone's scrutiny. To make matters worse, an unusual and unexpected problem had arisen. The daughter was approaching hysterics. It was worth it to go outside and see the child. She would change her route, but it was impossible to absolutely eliminate the possibility of meeting children. One day, Barbara and I were riding in the elevator, and a neighbor with a baby came in with us. Everything seemed fine, but I wasn't too happy. After the neighbor got off the elevator, I looked at my daughter and saw that her chin was bleeding. So hard she bit her lip trying to hold back a tantrum. After this incident, my daughter stayed at home all day and night for almost a month. Even a special doctor, the best of the best, I called home. There were changes, but not quick and not at all positive. After a period of apathy, my daughter became aggressive. It was as if she had developed an obsession, and the medications prescribed by the doctor couldn't handle it for long. Barbara would take the pills for a few hours, become apathetic. Then she'd start thinking about something, pacing the room from side to side. Once I saw that she was looking for poison options on the net, and I was seriously frightened. I realized that my daughter had decided to deal with the unwitting perpetrator of her children's deaths. I tried to be there all the time, to keep an eye on my daughter, so she wouldn't do anything irreparable. One morning, Barbara managed to leave the house while I was asleep. People told me later that she caught up with Frank after his work and attacked him with her fists. She was yelling, "Why are you living here? Why don't our sons? I don't know, maybe my acquaintances exaggerated." But supposedly 4 strong men could barely pull her away from a distraught Frank. He didn't even fight back. When I came to pick her up, my daughter was sitting in the back room, where the aroma of the hated Corvalol and some other drugs was wafting. She was almost unresponsive to anything. I was told that an ambulance had come and sedated Barbara. Among acquaintances and neighbors, of course, there was only talk about the accident with my grandchildren, and that Barbara was going crazy with grief. One day, Frank's father called me and urged me to leave town with his daughter. You don't say no to people like him. Besides, I was thinking of ways to hide my daughter from memories, sympathetic and prying eyes. I quit my job, sold my apartment, again thanks to my son-in-law's parents. I managed to do it quickly, and at a price that was quite adequate, given the urgency. Barbara and Frank were divorced in absentia, again thanks to his relatives. My daughter didn't even have to go anywhere. We ended up moving to this town, away from everything. And then you know the rest, Matthew. You met her and my daughter started to come back to life. Don't think Barbara still hates it. She's just still in pain. She even refuses the opportunity to be a mom again for fear of repeating the nightmare she went through. Audrey was silent. Telling her daughter's terrible story, the woman was mentally exhausted. Matthew noticed how pale her face had become and hurried to the kitchen to fetch her some water. Roger was playing on his phone, and the man stroked his head, refilled his glass, and returned to Audrey in the hall. "Sorry, what made you remember everything?" he asked. The woman drank the water carefully and spoke bitterly. "Ah, Matthew, if only it could be forgotten. I probably should have told you about Barbara's past sooner. I've been hesitant to tell you. My daughter still can't talk about it either, I understand." The man looked at the woman puzzled and confessed. "To be honest, I had no idea that Barbara's reluctance to become a mom could hide such a tragedy. I thought she probably didn't want to ruin her figure. I can't even imagine how she felt when she saw Roger in our kitchen. What a surprise to surprise her on our anniversary. How am I supposed to apologize to Barbara and make her understand?" I really didn't have anywhere to bring Roger, the man continued. And the boy, for a number of reasons. I had to be sheltered for a week or two in a comfortable and safe place where his parents' enemies would have no reason to look. It all came about almost by accident. I arrived at the branch and ran into an old friend on the street whom I hadn't seen since my discharge. Hugh is more than a friend. He's the only reason I survived the army. But it's a long story. In the civilian life, we were separated by our hometowns, and as it happens, our contacts were lost. I tried to find him on social networks, but no luck. I guess I should have been more persistent. Then I would have found him, and then I got busy building my career. Anyway, I hadn't seen him in 15 years, and now I meet Hugh in a city that's foreign to both of us. I know he's changed over the years, but I recognized him immediately. He almost walked past me without noticing, but I stopped him. It turned out Hugh had come to solve his sister's and her husband's problems. They were embroiled in a lawsuit with some inadequate people who were used to dealing with things in a criminal way. Roger, of course, is just a perfect boy. He got to know his way around in a strange place. He even went to bed by himself, having brushed his teeth beforehand. Hugh was most worried about Roger, his nephew. He explained to his sister that the child should be hidden just in case, because through him the bandits could easily influence the decision of the issue in their favor. But they couldn't think of any safe place. And that's where I came in. To Hugh, the idea of taking Roger out of town seemed the ideal. Indeed, there were practically no clues that could put the bandits on the child's trail. It was a good thing that the boy had a strong character, a real man growing up. His parents and Hugh told him he had to stay with me for a while, and he took the news calmly. I picked him up like a detective, so as not to get caught on the city's CCTV cameras. We agreed to contact Hugh in a week, and he's supposed to call me when it's resolved. Roger and I are very easy to talk to, but I have to work on Monday, and I can hardly take him with me. I don't know what to do now, the man said. Matthew was silent. Suddenly, he and Audrey heard Barbara's voice. It's no big deal. You go to work as usual. I'll stay with Roger, only on the condition that the boy didn't have to take public transportation himself. It turned out that, contrary to Audrey's calculations, her daughter had already returned from the theater and seemed to have heard part of her husband's story. Preempting her mother's question, Barbara explained. I couldn't watch the play in the theater. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and realized that I couldn't go back and stare at the stage without even trying to understand the story. I texted Gabriella to apologize and came here. Turns out I got back just in time. I guess I should have heard Roger's story from the outside because, Matthew, I'm sorry I suspected you of cheating. And I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me all that yesterday. Today I can look at the situation more rationally. Mom, you don't mind if I visit with Roger, do you? Barbara asked. Audrey, trying not to frighten away the change in her daughter's attitude toward her children, spoke very carefully. Of course, come. Audrey wanted to say something else, but tears came to her eyes and she decided to change the subject. Barbara. Matthew, aren't you hungry? I could eat something right now. Let's go into the kitchen. All the more reason to see if Roger's having a good time. I've forgotten all about the rules of hospitality. When the boy saw Barbara, he remembered to say hello. The woman's voice trembled slightly as she responded to his greeting. Matthew, who had understood the reason for his wife's strange behavior, was now amazed at her resilience. She had been through such an ordeal and had never tried to appeal to his pity or to elicit sympathy by telling him what she had faced. Barbara gently but insistently dismissed Audrey's attempts to feed everyone gathered in her kitchen that evening. Thank you, Mom, for everything, but we should probably go home. I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon, she said. Matthew, realizing that he had received his wife's forgiveness, was very happy and bid Audrey a heartfelt farewell, promising, "We'll visit you all tomorrow. If you are feeling well and the weather is warm, we can go to the countryside. How would you like that, Audrey?" That's a wonderful idea, Matthew. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, the woman said. After saying goodbye to the hostess, Barbara, Matthew, and Roger drove to the other side of town. The man sat behind the wheel, and in the mirror he could see his wife carefully fastening the boy's seatbelt. It was obvious that for Barbara it was a completely natural gesture, brought once to automaticity. She was obviously a reverent, caring mother. She loved her children very much, and after the tragedy that had befallen her, she was suffering in a way that her worst enemy could not wish. Matthew carefully parked the car in the driveway. The man carried Roger, who had drowned, to the apartment. Barbara laid him on the couch, spreading the crumpled sheet, carefully removed the boy's shoes and covered him with a blanket. Watching his wife, Matthew felt incredible tenderness for her. Suddenly, the woman he loved opened up to him from an unfamiliar side of her personality, and he realized that he had made the absolutely right choice. Later, with the door to the kitchen closed, they drank tea with the remaining cake, and as if there had been no wall of misunderstanding between them yesterday. With jokes and kisses, they planned the schedule for Sunday afternoon. The man dared to bring up the unpleasant subject and confessed. "Barbara, I'm a real idiot. I almost ruined everything by my actions. and I want to say thank you very much for understanding." His wife smiled. "Well, to be honest, I overreacted too. So I suggest we forget it. Forget it." The weekend passed cheerfully, and even better than the spouses expected. They managed to get Audrey out for a walk, who was much less happy about the sunny May day than she was about her daughter's happy eyes. Barbara was happy to answer Roger's questions, and to keep an eye on him to make sure he wasn't in danger. Neither her mother nor her husband dared to reproach her for her hyper-opaque behavior. Roger did not seem to mind at all that he was surrounded by the utmost care. By agreement with Barbara, he called her by her first name without using the word aunt, and he seemed quite pleased with his unexpected journey. When they had brought Audrey home after the entertainment, the trio had to wait, for there was no chance of leaving the woman without being fed. No one minded, however. Late in the afternoon, as Barbara was putting Roger to bed, the boy asked her quietly, "Do you think my parents are doing well? Will I be able to see them soon?" Trying to keep her voice firm and convincing, Barbara replied, "Of course they are doing well. Very soon they will do all their business, and you will meet them." The reassured boy fell asleep. Barbara, fearful of waking the child, called her husband into the kitchen and began to question him about the story Roger's parents were involved in. "Barbara, I honestly don't even know all the details of that evening. My husband told me everything very briefly. But I realized that his sister and her husband were really attacked by some scumbags." The woman began to ask questions that surprised her husband. "These bandits are from the town you went to, or are they newcomers? Did they call each other anything? Did they have nicknames?" Matthew told everything he knew. But it was not enough for Barbara, and she suddenly asked, "Can't you get in touch with Hugh urgently? I need to get some clarifications from him to try to help Roger's parents. Of course, he's not bad and quite comfortable with us, I hope, but it shouldn't be that mother and son are separated for long." It was impossible to guess from Barbara's voice how closely she took Roger and his parents' situation to heart. But now, knowing about his wife's past, Matthew realized how difficult it was for her. In fact, Hugh gave me a password to a chat room that automatically deletes all messages. I think we can try to contact him. The man opened the necessary site, entered the data that he had learned by heart at the request of his army friend, and after a few minutes he exclaimed with joy, "It worked. See, he welcomed me." Barbara thoughtfully advised, "Matthew, ask him a question that you can tell if he's talking to you. And if there's even the slightest doubt, close the site immediately and pull the SIM card out of the phone." Alarmed by his wife's suspicions, Matthew quickly typed a few phrases and waited impatiently for a reply. After reading the message he received, the man exhaled a sigh of relief. "It's okay. It's definitely Hugh," he answered with our code phrase. Barbara nodded and asked, "Okay, text Hugh that your wife will be texting him now. And give me the phone number. I'll find out everything I need to know from your friend." No longer surprised by anything, Matthew handed the smartphone to his wife. She texted with someone she didn't know for quite a while. Then she grabbed a pen, quickly wrote down a number on a bread wrapper, tore off a piece of paper with numbers on it, clutched it in her hand, and handed the phone to her husband. Barbara left the kitchen and headed for the bathroom, which had the best noise insulation in the apartment. After taking a few deep breaths, the woman dialed her former father-in-law's memorized number. But the phone was unavailable. Barbara gathered all her will and dialed her ex-husband's number. Soon his voice sounded in the receiver. "Hello. Don't be silent." "Frank, it's me, Barbara." Her voice trembled with excitement. "Barbara, it's good to hear from you." The man's demanding tone softened considerably. "My father is abroad, but if you tell me what the problem is, I'll do my best to help you. I am now working in the regional prosecutor's office, so all my connections are at your service." "Thank you," the woman replied and told me everything she had learned, dictating the number she had written down. "Okay, Barbara, I get it. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's manageable. I think in the end, for every scumbag, there's a more powerful force. I'll try to help and warn this acquaintance that I'll call him tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, depending on how things turn out. He'll be able to take the call from his cell phone." "Thank you, Frank." Without waiting for her ex-husband's retort, Barbara ended the conversation and washed her face with ice water, hoping that it would bring her at least a semblance of composure. During her conversation with Frank, she wanted to apologize to him, but she couldn't. The bitter resentment of his neglect, which had caused her to lose her children, still burned her heart. At the same time, Barbara was well aware that without the intervention of her ex-husband, who had extensive connections in the area, Roger's family was practically doomed. And she wanted to keep the boy safe and try to save his parents. For a while, Barbara sat in the bathroom, equalizing her breathing with exercises. Seeing that an hour had practically passed, she returned to Matthew in the kitchen and informed him of what Frank had said. The man texted his friend the information he had received from his wife and hugged Barbara tightly. He saw how exhausted the woman he loved had become in the last hour and didn't know how to help her. He wanted to protect her from all adversity. Instead, Barbara had to turn, as Matthew easily guessed, to the man who had nearly destroyed her destiny to the ground. The conversation stirred the woman. She released herself from Matthew's embrace and automatically began clearing the table, not paying attention to the fact that she was sending her husband's completely untouched food into the trash. Finally, the man intercepted her hand and suggested, "Drop the fuss. It's been a hard day and we need to rest." Even as she listened to the peaceful breathing of her sleeping husband, Barbara could not calm down. The images of her little ones came to her mind's eye. They smiled toothless smiles at her. Then they were going to kindergarten for the first time and turning to the window, waving their little hands at her. They give her Mother's Day cards. Here, obviously conspiring, instead of falling asleep, they clap loudly and unanimously when she starts to sing them a lullaby. How many pleasant moments there were, so carefully stored somewhere far away in the memory. And so rudely all had been crossed out by an accident. How many times she had warned her sons not to take risks. And they still wouldn't listen. But what was the use of being angry now? You can't get the water back. Their father is now the only hope that Roger will soon be able to hug his mother. At least let Frank be able to help this complete stranger to Barbara. "Bab, bab, bab," Roger mumbled, and Barbara slipped out from under her husband's arm and hurried to the boy. Carefully, she adjusted the blanket, which he had almost thrown to the floor. Felt Roger's forehead, frightened that the child had spiked a fever, and breathing a sigh of relief, sensing that, from her experience, all was well. Roger opened his eyes and Barbara sat down on the edge of the couch and hummed softly a lullaby. The boy had long since fallen asleep, but the woman remained seated beside him. She wanted the child to return to his parents as soon as possible, and at the same time she realized that she would desperately miss spending time with him. As the sky, visible through the slit between the curtains, lightened, Barbara went quietly to the kitchen to make herself some coffee and work on her papers, because there was no point in going to bed. In these lucid hours, maybe somewhere far away, were already deciding issues directly related to the fate of Roger. But Barbara was powerless to influence anything. She had already done all that she could, overcoming her resentment. And now all that remained was to wait for the result. After carefully studying the papers, the woman made notes in the margins, wrote out her suggestions on a separate sheet of paper, and carefully tucking everything away in a zippered folder, began, trying not to make any noise, to prepare breakfast. She had already decided to ask Audrey's boss to excuse her, so as not to tire the boy out too much by moving around unfamiliar places. After waiting for the time to send messages, Barbara typed to Audrey that she would send the prepared documents through her husband. She began to think about what she could do to please the little guest, who of course was worried about being separated from his parents, although he was trying to be a good boy. When Matthew, who had showered but was still yawning, came into the kitchen, Barbara had almost everything ready. She invited her husband to the table and asked, "Matthew, stop by on your way to Jack's and give him the file for me. I've already warned him that I won't be able to stop by work for a few days. And if there's anything that needs to be reviewed, have him email it to me or have it forwarded through you. As a last resort, of course, I'll come over. But I don't want to stress Roger out. I was going to take him to Audrey's mom's and then go to the Children's Entertainment Center. Why does he have to play on the computer all the time? Let him have fun, let him have fun, let him have fun, let him have fun. Keep his mind off the sad stuff. He was having nightmares at night." Matthew agreed to his wife's plan, and after quickly swallowing his breakfast, he thanked her and began to get ready for work. Roger woke up much later, but Barbara didn't think to wake him up. She wanted the boy to feel no discomfort. The woman fed the child and then suggested, "Let's stop by my mom's for a while and then we'll go somewhere to rest." Barbara received a text message on her phone, and she smiled when she saw the notification that the money had been deposited. Matthew made sure his wife didn't have any financial problems. The woman smiled and asked the boy, "Would you like me and you to go to an amusement park? It's not far from the city, and there are many different options for a fun vacation, a laughing room, rope courses, and I think even a climbing wall. Do you like that kind of active entertainment? Or maybe you prefer a movie? That's no problem either. I haven't seen a movie on the big screen in a long time." Roger confessed embarrassedly, "I'd rather go to an amusement park, to be honest. So that's where we'll head." Audrey was delighted when her daughter came to see her with the boy. It meant that Barbara believed her husband and didn't go out of her way to demand that the child be placed somewhere because of her traumas and memories. She could see that Barbara seemed desperate even after her brief interaction with Roger and barely got them to leave as soon as possible. "Daughter, I feel just fine today. Go have fun. I'll call you if there's anything, of course. In fact, don't worry about it. Really, I have more energy today after yesterday's walk." Audrey turned to the boy and asked Roger, "I beg you, rest well for you and for me." The boy nodded gravely and promised, "I'll have Barbara take pictures and send them to you. You have an advanced smartphone, don't you?" The woman smiled and praised. "Well done. That's a great idea. I'm sure I'll have fun with you." Barbara checked. "Do you have a charged cell phone?" Barbara reassured her mother, saying she could recharge her phone in the car at any time. Soon the guests left Audrey, and she, left alone, began to dream that her daughter would finally decide to be a mom again. It was obvious to the woman that Barbara could perfectly find a common language with children. She had suffered for so many years, purposely avoiding contact with them. "Let everything turn out well for the injured girl," Audrey pleaded, hoping aloud that the plea would be heard somewhere upstairs. Barbara, driving with particular care, was taking Roger for fun and felt the weight of the responsibility she had voluntarily taken on. The boy had first of all asked to go on the rope course, and the woman had agreed. She wanted to grab the child in her arms and hold him in her arms. Barbara watched the boy and took photos from time to time, but she didn't dare to distract herself from sending especially expressive pictures to her mother. It seemed to the woman that if she took her eyes off the boy for even a few seconds, something bad would happen. The thought crossed her mind of the degree of desperation Roger's mom was in if she agreed to give her son to a near stranger. Such an act could only be dared because of the real threat to the child's life and health. So she, Barbara, had no right to let down a woman about whom she knew the bare minimum of information: name, surname, age, and the fact that the unfortunate woman, together with her husband, had gotten involved in a story from which she could not get out on her own. Barbara, however, was in an even more advantageous position. Erin, Roger's mother, knew even less about the people who had taken her son in. The fun-filled Monday had flashed by without a second thought. The boy, tired from his many outdoor activities, fell asleep after a hearty dinner and rested peacefully until morning without crying out or waking up. Matthew and Barbara chatted quietly in the kitchen. The woman spoke enthusiastically about how bravely Roger had conquered the rides and showed pictures. "Tomorrow I want to take our guest to our museums after his visit to his mother, and then go to the movies. Or vice versa, whichever Roger wants. If you can join us, it'll be fun. He's so funny, and sometimes he has such deep thoughts. He told me today that adults try to look serious on purpose so that they'll be afraid and no one will bother them. Can you believe that?" The man agreed that there was something reasonable in that conclusion. "And I suggest, Barbara, let's go to bed like Roger. Because tomorrow I expect it's going to be just as busy." Neither Tuesday nor Wednesday brought word from Frank or the boy's relatives. Although the child attended all sorts of entertaining and educational establishments, his mood grew worse every day. He became more and more reflective and sad. Matthew and Barbara realized that the boy was missing his family more and more, but they could not influence the situation. Only on Thursday, when Barbara and Roger were visiting Audrey, the long-awaited call came. Frank informed his ex-wife that the main difficulties were over and warned, "There are still a few things to be resolved, but that's minor. The main thing is that the boy is no longer in danger. His parents have already left in the direction of the city where you now live, I warned them to call you in advance, as they will arrive, and clarify the address. Anyway, I'll take this case to the final point, of course. Don't worry." Barbara thanked her ex-husband profusely. "Thank you, Frank, and forgive me for everything." The man's voice was ringing as he replied to the woman he had hurt so much. "Barbara, you don't know how glad I am to hear from you, even if it's for such an occasion. I wish you happiness, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to contact me. I'll always be glad to help you." Barbara said goodbye to her ex-husband. Audrey, hearing her daughter's conversation, couldn't believe her own ears. It seems that her Barbara quite adequately just communicated with a man whom she had once loved and then hated. "Mom, we have to leave. Roger's parents are already on the road, and I still need to give him a bath." The child realized that he would soon see his mom and dad and started jumping around the room, shouting yay. Barbara barely managed to keep him quiet. Audrey, happy that the situation had been resolved safely, gave the boy a souvenir of her photograph and a collection of stamps, which he liked so much. "Here you go, Roger. You'll look at the album and remember." "I won't forget me, Grandma Audrey," even without stamps, the child promised. Seizing the moment, Barbara called her husband to tell him the good news, but it turned out he already knew. "Barbara, Hugh told me that your help has solved everything. I'm taking a cab home now to get ready for the party." Barbara was a little sad to part with the boy who had awakened in her memories of the most joyous days with her sons, and she invited him to visit the toy store on the way. "You know, I'd really like to get you something too. Choose whatever you want." The boy did not resist, but apparently embarrassed, did not walk for a long time between the racks with toys on display, and very soon he took from the shelf not the most expensive robot. On the way to the checkout, Barbara put in the basket an airplane, which Roger had once told her admiringly, and some more board games. "Oh, so many things," marveled the child. "What a celebration today." "Yes, Roger, it's a very big party today," Barbara agreed. By the time the doorbell rang, the boy was already cleanly ransomed and the cutlery was flaunting on the table. Erin, barely over the threshold, rushed to her son, hugging him and showering him with kisses. The boy's father handed Barbara flowers, and Hugh gave Matthew a firm, manly hug. After Roger, assuming the role of an adult, introduced the parents to the owners of the apartment, everyone sat down to eat. Erin volunteered to help Barbara and confessed, "If it weren't for your kindness, I don't know how we would have gotten through this. I don't know how to express my gratitude. My husband and I have raised money to offset the cost of Roger and your inconvenience." Barbara turned pale and replied, "Erin, put that envelope away at once. Don't insult me with this act. You have a boy who will be going to school soon, so spend this money on him. If it's not too much trouble, send me and my husband a picture of him once in a while. That would be the best, thanks." Outraged, Erin burst into tears and hugged Barbara. When Roger, disturbed by his mother and Barbara's long absence from the table, looked into the kitchen, he saw the women roaring, unable to hold back their tears, and began to ask in a mature manner, "What happened? Did you get bumped, cut, burned?" Barbara and Erin wiped away their tears synchronously. "It's okay, sweetie, and everything is just fine," the mom reassured her son. Putting her arms around the boy, she picked him up, lifted him up, and surrounded him. Barbara watched the happy people and did not feel envy, but wished that this family had all the turmoil in the past. After the guests had departed, Barbara trustingly snuggled up to her husband and confided to him, "You know, I think I'm ready for motherhood. Roger proved to me that children are the greatest happiness." The man did not change his wife's mind. Soon Barbara pleased him and Audrey with the news of her pregnancy. Exactly on time and without any complications, the woman gave birth to a daughter. The girl was named Sharon in honor of Matthew's army friend, and as a symbol of victory over the terrible memories of the past. In the evening, the loud sounds of Indian melodrama could be heard in the house. The cheerful music sounded like mockery. Julia's daughter-in-law, the lady of the house, had been doing chores late into the night. Now she was tearfully scrubbing the floors of the spacious four-room apartment, while Mendelssohn's March played in her head and the words came to mind: Registrar. "Do you, Linda, agree to be Christopher's wife?" Why had she agreed? gave in to her fiancé's entreaties to live with her mother. She put on her wedding ring and was transported into a dark world of hopelessness. Christopher, indulging his mother in everything, did not believe his wife. There was no miracle. Her husband was not going to support and protect her in a difficult moment. And the mother-in-law was dodgy, weaving intrigues, loaded unnecessary work, conspired against the daughter-in-law. It was not the difficulties of family life that frightened Linda, but Christopher's misunderstanding, the unfairness of life. Today she was worried that she had scrubbed the floors for the second time only because her mother-in-law did not believe her, because she had already cleaned the whole house in the morning. In the evening, Christopher supported his mother, not understanding why his wife was stubbornly unable to do simple housework. When she finished cleaning, Linda quietly snuck into the bathroom and closed herself in. Here she could give free rein to her feelings, rest from the family burden. The well-appointed apartment, unlike her country house, was a joy to bathe in at any time, without heating the stove. It was a small consolation to Linda. She missed the peacefulness of the village, her yard, the warmth of communication with the villagers. She drew water with a snow-white cap of foam and sank into the tub with pleasure. She remembered again the carefree moments of her unmarried life, and then her acquaintance with Christopher and her sudden wedding. Linda had fallen in love with the kind guy on the motorcycle. At first sight, Christopher then came to his grandmother in the village. One day, driving through the village, he saw a lovely girl with a black braid down to her waist, a gentle look, and a basket in her hands. It was a marvelous vision, as if a forest nymph had come out of the pages of books. She was walking with the little girl's basket, which had been composed to her by a kind-hearted grandmother for a letter from her son. Christopher stopped and asked her to treat him to a strange berry he had never seen before. Thus began a relationship. The guy surrounded his beloved with care and invited her to live in his luxurious 4-room apartment. Linda immediately did not like Julia Urban, spoiled woman who did not want a soul in her son. She disapproved of her son's girlfriend and called her cunning. And here was a gift from Christopher, a village shepherdess, an orphan of Kazan, without a family and tribe. Linda buried her parents long ago and lived poorly, a lonely postmistress. And at her husband's insistence, she quit her job and moved to the city. Why? What for? There was a persistent knock at the door. Julia's irritated voice brought her out of her reverie. "Are you at it again? How many times have I told you not to lock the door? How many times have I told you not to lock the doors? You haven't brought a penny into the house yourself, and yet there you are, a lady bathing every day. Open the door at once. I have to go to the bathroom. I have a scheduled beauty treatment." "Mom, what's wrong?" Christopher came running to the door. "Your wife wouldn't clean my room, so I had to do it myself. I have a bad back. The medicine's in the bathroom. I've been here for an hour and she won't do it. And she was rude to me. Talk to your wife. You're doing the same old thing. You're slandering me, Mom." Linda opened the door in astonishment, hastily climbing out of the bathroom. "It's been 15 minutes, and I've mopped the floors in every room," she objected. "Look at you, you cheeky girl. Get out of my sight." Julia shoved her sister-in-law violently in the side, causing her to fall. "Linda, stop quarreling with your mother," Christopher said coldly. "Show some respect. Please, if it's not too much trouble for your highness." He turned around and walked away. Angrily stupid. Day after day, her mother-in-law nagged, making up tall tales, complaining about her deteriorating health because of such an ungrateful daughter-in-law. Linda baked pies, cooked French and Italian dishes, studied new recipes, watched blogs on homemaking. Nothing worked. The main goal of the mother-in-law was to get rid of her daughter-in-law by any means necessary, to kick her out for no reason, because such a girl is out of status. Christopher was a famous lawyer, and his late husband was a prosecutor. They still had long-standing ties. They had important visitors, very influential people in the city. Julia was shy of Linda, who didn't know how to handle cutlery. Linda dressed simply gray, refused to go to beauty salons. Her unwillingness to get her hair and nails done made Julia mad at guests. Mother-in-law politely, but coldly pulled her daughter-in-law, told her not to show her face to anyone. A hard, tedious, joyless year passed. Linda got a job as a saleswoman in a store near the house. Her husband stopped giving her money at her mother's instigation. At work, her daughter-in-law was relieved from the endless reproaches. But at home, it got worse. Now, Julia reproached her daughter-in-law for not doing her chores. "My darling, you're always at work, and your husband must be fed and cared for. I'll talk to my son, so he won't let you slack off from housework." "Mom, I have time for everything," Linda objected. "I cook in advance, everything's in order. I clean up morning and night." "What's this new fashion of working? Quit working. I'm ashamed you're working as a saleswoman with a husband like that. It's a disgrace. Christopher doesn't even leave me money for my household because of you. And I still have a house in the country to keep, bills to pay. Orphan of Kazan, you don't need to spend our money. Christopher buys everything for the house." The arguments upset Linda. Later, her mother-in-law reprimanded her son for how rudely his wife talks to her, does not listen to her advice. Linda was deeply hurt by Julia's words that she was ashamed of her uneducated daughter-in-law. It was painful to remember why Linda never enrolled in the institute. Hope was the pride of her parents. She graduated from high school with honors, planned to enter the medical academy. But a month after graduation, her parents were in an accident, returning from the city. My father died in the hospital without regaining consciousness. Mom slipped into a coma. For 6 months, Linda traveled to all the hospitals, begging in the hope of saving her mother, bribed, begged for an operation. But the situation was hopeless. No one could help. Mom never woke up again. Having buried her mother, Linda was left an orphan. To get by, she worked part-time in a store, then found a job at the post office. The road to the academy was closed. There was nothing to pay for her studies. Linda spent all the money she had saved on hospitalization and funeral expenses. The hard fate did not bother her mother-in-law. She could not allow a homeless girl from the village to run her house. Julia found a new way to get rid of her daughter-in-law. "Christopher," she said to her son, "we need an heir. Why can't your wife get pregnant?" "Mom, it's been so little time. Perhaps it's too soon to talk about children." "My dear, a child will help reconcile us all. My dear, it's such a blessing. I'd be so happy if you'd give me a grandchild." The cunning mother-in-law cried and hugged her son. "All right, I'll talk to Linda. But I agree, it's up to me." In the evening, Christopher pleased his wife with his desire to have children. He didn't say anything about his mother's request. Julia went to extreme measures, which became known later. Linda rejoiced at the possibility of becoming a mom. A child could really soften her husband, and her life would be happier. She had been living with the dream of a child since her wedding, but she had been unable to get pregnant. Another 6 months passed. Linda cried as she held the pregnancy test in her hands. Disappointment again. Fear settled in her soul. Her mother-in-law would scream. Her husband would support her mother and angrily slam the door. For the 2nd month, he began to appear less often at home, stayed late at work, met with friends. Julia was satisfied she had broken up the young people after all. There was one last step to take. One day, Linda came into the room and saw Christopher. He was sitting there with his face twisted with anger. When he saw his wife, he swung and hit her in the face. "Ungrateful bitch," he shouted and threw a packet of pills at her. "How dare you lie to me and Mom? Explain to me what these are." "These are pills, but this is the first time I've seen them." Linda read the instructions with shaking hands. They were birth control pills. The weight of the last few months of endless humiliation, frustration, and disappointment fell on her in an instant. She collapsed without feeling, no longer wanting to live and breathe in this cruel, absurd world. Christopher, although angry at his wife, felt guilty, but could not bring her to her senses and called an ambulance. Julia snickered at the pills and indifferently sent her daughter-in-law to the hospital. "Mom, why is she doing this to me?" Christopher complained bitterly to his mother. I told you, I told you. I told you, I told you, I told you, I told you. Don't you dare forgive her. This is no way to get a divorce, Mother. I promised her she'd be happy, but she lied to me too. I'll go to work early in the morning, and then I'll visit my wife and talk to her calmly." 3 days later, Linda was discharged. She took the bus home. Christopher didn't meet her, he was at work. A suitcase and a note from her husband about the divorce were waiting for her at home. Her mother-in-law was triumphant. She threw Linda out without letting her wait for her husband. She was just a village idiot, and she still is. You shouldn't have messed with all of us. Get out. I can't see you, you snake. You wanted to separate me from my son. It won't happen. Out, out, I said, immediately. So that you don't breathe. The mother-in-law shouted after her, unwilling to stop her anger and triumph at the same time. In the evening, Christopher found out that his wife had left. Mom, why didn't Linda wait for me? How dare she leave me? Why didn't she say anything? Calm down, son. It was her decision. Julia was careful not to mention the note she'd written, copying her son's handwriting. But how? She didn't even leave a note. You two haven't been getting along for a long time. This woman isn't right for you. What will that hillbilly have for you? Without children, there's no family. It's an omen that if she did, she'd give birth to an inbred simple thing that's nothing to breed. Look for a wife of status by getting rid of your daughter-in-law. Julia felt over the moon she had gotten her way on the plan. For a year, she drank Linda a decoction of wormwood, convincing her that this tea is good for women's health, hoping to bring a young, healthy girl to infertility. Then she slipped her birth control pills. Christopher was upset. He figured Linda hadn't forgiven him for the slap. With longing in his heart, he walked across the room where he smelled her perfume. Sitting down on the bed, he went through the pills. A suspicion crept into his soul. The packages were intact, all the pills in place. Perhaps Linda hadn't taken them. He remembered hundreds of moments when his wife had cried and complained about her mother and he hadn't believed her. The bitter discovery struck his heart with the pain of no return, of loss. He himself, with his own hands, had destroyed love. There is no forgiveness, but Linda is his beloved, without whom it is so lonely and dreary. He will rent an apartment for her, and tomorrow he will go to the village to beg for forgiveness. An Indian song was playing loudly in the next room. Julia, with a blissful smile, was triumphant. She was more at ease when others were suffering, but her carefree life did not last long. One day she would receive a letter that would turn her whole life upside down, change her character, teach her to be compassionate, empathize, do good. But now she was far from even a moment's regret for her dastardly deed. Christopher didn't get out to his wife's home village right away. He had to see the client through to the end. A week later, he took a vacation and went to Linda. As 2 years ago, he decided to ride a motorcycle to return former feelings. He did not inform his mother about his departure. He was offended by her, tried to avoid talking. He even looked anxiously at his sad son, hoping that time would heal him. Julia was already looking for a worthy match for him, obedient society girl, which will distract from sad thoughts. More than once she tried to talk about divorce, but the son waved away, avoiding an answer. Christopher settled all his affairs, packed his backpack secretly from his mother and left the house. It was a clear spring day, bright. Gladly he set off on his long-awaited journey. Soon he would meet his beloved, whom he missed incredibly. It seemed to him that just today their family would open a new page of life. They would be happy, for he loved Linda so much. The road was covered with frost from the morning. In Siberia, even in May, there were frosts. Prudently, Christopher wore a balaclava and helmet, but the summer tires could fail. But that didn't stop his desire to impress Linda, to revive pleasant memories. The voice of reason was silent as Christopher accelerated, feeling a rush of energy, freedom, and lightness of mind. It was a 2-hour non-stop ride to the village. The road was a country road, not a soul around. After an hour and a half, Christopher carelessly jumped into the oncoming lane. At that time, a tractor appeared from behind the corner. It was too late to stop. He jerked the wheel to the left. The bike rammed into bushes and hit a tree. The brakes didn't work. The wheels skidded. Christopher was thrown from the saddle and rolled down the side of the road. He was unlucky to have a savior. The driver of the tractor was Max, an ex-con who didn't want to be investigated again. He slowed down, hoping to help the motorcyclist. But Christopher showed no signs of life. So Max took his things, got back into the tractor and drove off, leaving the unfortunate man to die. He didn't say anything about the accident, didn't even feel remorse. It was an accident, it was not the tractor driver's fault, and humanity, unfortunately, is inherent in few people. On the same day, Julia's mother missed her son. She found out that he had taken a week's vacation, but he wasn't answering his phone. What a stubborn man, went to his redneck. Did I alarm him or what? Julia thought. She knew where Linda lived before her marriage, but she was not going to go to her place. She decided to wait a week and see. Julia called her mother Peggy in the village to ask if her grandson had shown up. No, he hadn't. Her son's cell phone went dead. A week later, he still hadn't returned. She decided to go to the village herself. She reached Peggy's mother, whom she rarely saw or spoke to. The news was shocking. It had been a year since Christopher had visited his grandmother, whose name was Madeline. He had not come to the village a week ago, nor yesterday, nor the day before. Linda, the letter carrier, do you know anything? Julia asked her mother. It's your sister-in-law, my dear. Are you out of your mind? Peggy was silent, shaking her head. Something flashed in her eyes. She hasn't been in the village for years. Didn't she come to live with you? She and Christopher have been divorced for 2 weeks. Where else would she go but to the village? She's been away. We're almost next door, 2 houses down. Julia, you're not making a mess, are you? I know you. I know you. Where did the kids go? They ran away from you, didn't they? They did the right thing. I raised a viper, not a daughter. You don't show your face around here, you don't help your mother. If it wasn't for Christopher, I'd be all alone. Mom, you never understood me, and I couldn't stand this village. What good is it? I'm sorry, but I was raising my son. It was hard. He's back on his feet. He hasn't forgotten anyone. That's my son. I raised him that way. So you survived, Linda? I was a redneck myself, remember? You got a temper, Julia. I'm ashamed I raised a daughter like that. Peggy told me what happened. Why did the children run away from you? My son must have gone to Linda's. His motorcycle's not in the garage. Where did it go? I don't know. I'm so sorry. Julia couldn't hold back any longer. She clasped her hands together and wailed. Son, where are you, my darling? It's all my own fault. Let's go together, Peggy. Maybe they're lurking out there living. I'll give you the address. It's no use. I don't go. You go on your own and don't come back to my place alone, it'll be safer. You go, I'll call you if the kids turn up. Julia went to the address, but no one was home. She knocked at neighbors' houses. Went all around the neighborhood. Still, there was neither Linda nor her husband for a year. No one came. No one knocked. Julia, by old habit, went to collect information in the village and the store, at the post office, at the club. But it was as if Linda had vanished into thin air. With a heavy heart, she returned to the city. The trail had been broken. Her friends and acquaintances didn't know where her son was. He never showed up for work, never signed his resignation papers. Christopher disappeared without a trace. The last desperate step, a report to the police about the disappearance. For another year, Julia pounded the thresholds of government agencies, visited her mother in the village. There was no sign of her son. Later, remorse overwhelmed Julia. Nothing could dull the pain of loss. It was impossible to believe in her son's death. So she lived lonely, remembering the moments when they were together, though not always friendly. As long as he lived with that hillbilly, as long as he was near. The house was hopelessly silent now. Julia cried at the window all day long with an absent look, but she believed that her son would return. The story didn't end there. Christopher survived. He was saved by a family of witch doctors from the village of Red, which was in the neighborhood of his native village. It was an abandoned village with a few houses, where only the old residents remained to live. They traveled to their native village for everything they needed: groceries, things, small household items. On that fateful day, the daughter of the old witch doctor Luba went to the store through the village. First she saw a mangled motorcycle, and a little farther away Christopher unconscious. What grief! He must have crashed. What a handsome man he was. She sighed and shook her head. The girl's name was Roberta. She was trained in first aid, and often helped her mother treat people. Roberta checked and realized that the young man was alive, but it was not customary for the old-timers to call an ambulance. They lived in the same family, in case of trouble helped each other themselves. So Roberta ran for help. Christopher was taken to Luba's house. Things were bad. The victim hadn't regained consciousness for a week. They searched around the motorcycle, but they didn't find any documents, phone, or belongings. They were taken by a resourceful tractor driver so that there would be no trace of them at all. The stuff was just for his own use. He burned all the papers, even his passport. There was a man and he's gone, missing. The stranger woke up on the 8th day. Next to him sat a black-eyed beauty with a thick braid. When she saw that the patient opened his eyes, she jumped up and cried out, "Mommy, he's awake. Come here." A young but stately woman came in, bent over him, held his hand. "My dear, how will you live now? Where did you come from? What's your name?" But Christopher was so weak he couldn't speak. He shook his head, trying to say something, but he couldn't get a word out. "Roberta, go and get him some broth and tea." "I guess he can't talk. Then maybe he'll write from where?" The man was horrified to realize that he didn't remember his own name. Moreover, he didn't know who he used to be or who he even was. He hammered desperately, trying to get up, fell silent and lost consciousness again. He was later brought out. That's right, resiliently. The guys brought his motorcycle back, put it back together. They wanted to use it to identify the man, but somehow they forgot. It's no use, they thought. After all, the village had hardly developed. A good man, we need him. Christopher didn't remember his former life. It was his fate. Scarlett nursed Christopher back to health. She had fallen madly in love with him. He, too, was enchanted by this extraordinary, caring girl of fabulous beauty. In time, Christopher began to talk. He turned out to be a jack of all trades. He quickly learned to build, put up a log cabin for his own Scarlett, and furnished it. And so they lived together. Vague pictures of the past surfaced, but nothing made sense. With some secret excitement, he looked at the frost, and then all was eclipsed by lethargy. The memories went no further. Christopher was no longer himself. He was given a new name, William, slipped the papers of a long-dead man, buried but not registered as dead. William Davidovich Redfill was born. For a long time he couldn't remember where he came from, who he worked for, or why he was on that road. And Julia was still waiting for her son's return. Her motherly heart told her he was alive. It had been 5 years since his disappearance. Christopher had been reported missing. The bleak days dragged on. It seemed as if nothing would happen until she died. Then one day she received a letter. A very strange message came from the village of Chaslevoix from Linda. On a white sheet of paper was written only one word: monkey. What nonsense. Julia shook the envelope. Nothing more than that. A gap. On the window, the sheet was blank. "That's what I said. She's a mad fool," she muttered. That same day, she left for the village. The first thing she did was to go to Linda's house. She didn't remember at all her son's story about how he met his wife. This time, the door to the house was thrown open wide. It was empty inside. Julia walked through the rooms. It didn't look like anyone lived here. Dust, cobwebs, the smell of damp in the corners. A long, uninhabited dwelling. But in the midst of this emptiness, on the windowsill stood a tattered portrait of a sweet little girl. Julia shuddered and cried. Christopher's bottomless blue eyes were staring at her. She grabbed the portrait, read the inscription at the bottom, Mary. On the back, Mary Christopher Redfield. Can't be. How could it be? For 5 years I've been alone, with my granddaughter growing up next to me. All because of Linda, the village witch. All because of her. She took away my son and hid my granddaughter. What a bastard. Julia howled as she stared at the photograph, stroking the face that bore the features of her precious Christopher. Then she sat down and burst into tears. Tears of remorse flowed in streams. It was she herself who had kicked the good girl out without complaint. She had given her wormwood to keep her from becoming a mother. But what a cruel fate. Linda gave her a daughter and took everything away from her. It's karma. Linda shouldn't have treated her like that. It was getting dark. There was no electricity in the house, so this wasn't where her sister-in-law lived. Julia stood up from the floor, frozen for 5 years, her heart bleeding. Anxious thoughts lingered. She walked to her mother's house. Here, too, The door was thrown open wide. No one inside, empty and desolate. She hadn't been to her hometown of Sunset Valley in a year. She'd given up hope of finding her son and stopped calling. Without her, her mother must have died. No one else in the world. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry." "Where are you?" Julia said, clutching her temples, and fell senseless. She woke up in the dark. The door was cold. She had to find her granddaughter and ask Linda what was wrong with her mother. There was no electricity in the house. She went into the kitchen. As they had been when she was a child, candles lay in a drawer. Julia lit one, set down a glass, and sat alone in the semi-darkness in the chair where she had sat as a small, carefree, mischievous girl 45 years ago, the glare playing on the wall. The silence was incredible. The world froze here in an instant. Not rushed, not demanding sacrifice. What had happened to her soul? The city had taken everything good out of her, made her a cruel city girl. And it's not square meters, water from the tap that you need to stay alive. That's the feeling when you realize you're a real person. Only the countryside can reveal the soul. Julia should have been born again. Sitting alone on that chair in the semi-darkness, where her mother had not thrown it away because she had waited all her life for her daughter's return, in that moment she came home with her whole soul. The grief helped to make sense of the emptiness of her meaningless life in those short hours, as if counting down the time of rebirth. Night had fallen. Business had to be postponed until tomorrow. Julia unraveled her black braid and brushed it out. In the morning she woke with the dawn. Anxiously she opened the closet in her former room, went through the dresses she had worn when she was young. This was where she had lived until she was married, until she met a promising boyfriend who had become a lawyer. Later they had already left the village, bought an apartment in the city. The clothes were too small. Julia slammed the closet doors. She went into her mother's room, pulled back the closet. There were rows and rows of weekend dresses, all in perfect order, on parade, even the perfume still on. It was an old habit of her mother's to walk around the village only in skirts or dresses. Julia stood in indecision. Taking her mother's things, Julia didn't dare. It wasn't clear what had happened. It was bad luck to wear the belongings of the deceased. But surely she would have been informed if her mother had died. With that thought in mind, she cheerfully selected a plain, straight-cut monochrome dress and changed, taking off her pantsuit she had arrived in. Angrily, she tossed the suit into the dresser. Like a frog, she took off her skin, transforming herself into a beautiful maiden. Julia was a slender, beautiful woman in her 50s, but her strict outfits and dark clothes made her look old. Now she was happily fidgeting in front of the mirror, as if she were a dozen years younger in this simple, old-fashioned dress. It was time to make inquiries, stock up on groceries, and get the house in order. She went out into the street. The wonderful country air made her dizzy. After standing, enjoying the silence, Julia walked to the next house. She wondered why she hadn't thought to go there earlier in the evening. "Hello, Rosemary," said the old landlady when she saw Julia in her neighbor's dress. "Have a good day to you too?" Silence, continued the old lady. "Tell me, where's my mother? With a daughter like that, you can't die." "Fate, it can't be. You, my dear, do not deserve to know the truth," said the neighbor harshly, turning away. "Tell me, I beg you very much, is she alive?" Rosemary stood up, picked up her club, and walked to the porch. The silence lengthened. "She's alive. You get out of here. I have nothing more to say. Don't come here. I won't say anything else. It's up to you to decide how you want to live your life." "Dylan," I shouted loudly, "we'll send Peggy out to graze, and we'll send this one out too," she muttered under her breath, but Julia heard her. She had accomplished nothing more. Dylan, the neighbor's son, passed by without looking or speaking. Julia stood for a moment, then angrily strode away. She passed 5 other neighbors. 2 had already left the village. Their houses were boarded up, their vegetable gardens abandoned, all overgrown with grass in the height of summer. The other 2 neighbors she knew couldn't explain anything, saying that her mother had moved away, but she wouldn't say where. But the village was thriving. A new store had opened. People were farming, putting the cattle out to pasture. The hospital was working. On the local bulletin board, there was a poster advertising a recreation center by the river. The villagers' inquiries were fruitless. Julia decided she had to make a fresh start. Not for nothing received a strange message: the portrait of her granddaughter will change, earn forgiveness. Fate, the girl laughed at her. She decided to start with a temporary move. I rented an apartment in the city, put it on the alarm system. That way she wouldn't have to worry. But she didn't take almost any things with her. Her old taste seemed unacceptable for the countryside. Julia went to the stores and bought suitable clothes for work and everyday life. She spent the rest of the evening tidying up the household, going through the kitchen utensils. Everything was in a poor state of repair. The old things were old. The wallpaper had not been changed for years. Now she realized how much worse the house was in need of repair. She hadn't thought about it, leaving her mother alone in the village. She only threw in a pittance occasionally, sending money a couple times a year. How her mother lived here alone was incomprehensible. And a bitter thought befell the negligent daughter: what if her son had left her alone like that? Would it be easy for her to live? Her heart was troubled. How could she do such a thing? No, she deserved everything that had happened to her. You can't be selfish, thinking only of yourself. Everything will be different now, she proclaimed into the void, wiping away her tears. Julia spent the rest of the evening cleaning the house. She made a list of things to buy in town. Figured she'd go to the village hall to find out when her mother had last paid the light bill. It turned out that the bills had been paid only 3 months ago. The landlady herself came to Linda's house, and she was treated warily, but the payment was accepted. In the evening, the electricity came on, illuminating the rooms with a cold, dim light. In the morning, Julia packed for the city. She drove her car to the village, leaving it at the gate for the night. But after thinking for a while, she went to her neighbor's house, snuck into the house, knocked. It was open. The house was clean, spacious, everything was in order. Her son had done his best to repair the house. Julia felt ashamed that she had never helped anyone. The angry landlady was about to send her away. "Rosemary, I'm sorry. I was mean. It was my fault," Julia said. "What a sly fox," grinned the neighbor. "I won't tell you anything. You know you're right. It's too early to forgive your mother. I must find my son and granddaughter before them. I am guilty. So why did you come to me? Go back to your place. No one needs you here." "I've decided to stay here for the summer. I've been invited," Julia muttered quietly, remembering the letter from her. "What do you want?" "I'm going into town to do some repairs on my mother's house. I came here to ask if there's anything you need to buy." "Buy whatever Rosemary decides," the neighbor smirked slyly. "What are you from the bottom of my heart? Can I help you?" "Oh, my dear," suddenly smiled neighbor. "I can't pretend to be angry for long. Come to me. I babysat you while your mother was at work." To her great amazement, all of her aunt's admitted sternness did not go away. She hugged Julia, wiping away her tears. "Wait till I write you a list. And I have to ask my son. He wanted to go to town too. Maybe he could come with you." Rosemary's son was a little older than Julia. As children, they were friends and quarrelsome, annoying each other with various mischief. At 15, Dylan left his mother and went to school to become an electrician. Then he came back, got a job here, got married, made an addition to the house. We had a household, we lived together. How painful it was for her mother to see it. Her daughter got married and never came back. "Hey, Dylan." Julia finally found the right words. "Hi," from the hatch. Dylan smiled, remembering her past offenses. "Come on, don't bring up old times. I'm going to town. Your mother made a list. Maybe you should go too. Will you come with me?" "You're not at the robbery," Julia said. The irony was uncalled for. When she was a kid, she'd thrown herself behind the wheel of his motorcycle, but she'd lost control. Drove off a bridge into a river, and they were rescued. They banned the bike. Dylan didn't forgive her for that and stopped talking to her altogether. He'd do little things, like scare me with caterpillars or throw mice. "Don't worry, I've been driving for 20 years, said Rosemary. "My husband gave me a car for my wedding, and I learned right away." "And you buried your husband?" Dylan asked. My mother told me. God rest his soul. I'm sorry. What you reminded? Rosemary sighed. Nothing. Where did your wife die? Went out on the ice in the spring, trying to rinse her laundry. It sucked her in. She wasn't rescued, Dylan said quietly. Dylan said quietly, looking away. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was a long time ago. Let's go to town. Wait, I've changed. While Dylan was getting ready, a girl with a bag over her shoulder ran up to Linda. Hello. Do you live in this house? Yeah, I'm here to see my mother. Yeah, here's a letter to this address. Sign here, please. Thank you, girl. Come and visit if you have time. I have to go. Goodbye. On the light-colored envelope was her mother's address, but it was addressed to Julia. Julia opened it anxiously. Was someone trying to teach her a lesson or take revenge? On the white sheet of paper in large letters was a single word, wormwood. Julia shrieked, dropped the sheet. Linda had learned that her mother-in-law's evil deeds could have left her barren. How could that be? Could she have peeked at her while Linda was in the kitchen making herbal tea for her daughter-in-law? What are you standing there for? You got your mouth open? Dylan asked, approaching and seeing the leaf. He picked it up, reading the strange message in amazement. What is this nonsense? Did you get a letter? Your correspondent is obviously not very verbal. Dylan laughed, but quickly stopped, seeing that Julia stood in a daze with a lost look. Let's go. The road was silent. They didn't even turn on the music. Dylan dozed in the passenger seat, then opened his eyes. Your mother came to see us a week ago. What? Julia braked hard, almost hitting Dylan's forehead. She's feeling better. You guys get in. I'd rather walk. You're being a bit of a jerk. I'm sorry. But why didn't Aunt Rosemary tell me? I was so worried. Do you know what I've been through? I've already buried her in my mind. Don't yell. What's going on? Julia said it quietly, pulling over to the curb. I don't know. They were whispering in the kitchen without me. And my mother forbade me to talk about it. Don't ask me anything. I'm gonna go, Linda said. Here we go. Wait. I'll find out for myself. Don't say anything. Let's go. The shopping trip took longer than they thought. It was getting dark by the time they filled the trunk in the back seats. Julia talked Dylan into spending the night at her apartment. He walked around the rooms for a long time, looking amazed. It's like a museum. What kind of place is this? You must be crazy to live in the country. There's a living room as big as your mother's house. Yes. Yes, my mother lives in poverty and my daughter lives in luxury. Patricia's herding the flock is marvelous. Dylan, I know everything. Calm down, Julia stopped him. You'll sleep on the couch. Come on. I'll feed you, but I won't give you caviar. I'll feed you, you furry hedgehog. Dylan replied playfully. Julia thought that it was unbearable to live alone. Caring for others gave her energy. Dylan was thoughtful, looking at his mistress with respect. The evening was not going well. The guest was obviously hiding something from her, but Linda didn't ask any more. The letters led her to some goal, like stages of tests she had to pass. In the early morning, Dylan got up, lifting Julia. He never left his mother alone for long. He had to help with the chores. They came back when the neighbor had already put the cow out to graze. Why didn't you come back yesterday? Every hour counts. I can't cope anymore. And it's getting scary to spend the night alone, the neighbor said. And then she smiled and invited us to tea. They unloaded the shopping. Julia brought a set of pots and pans as a gift for her neighbor. She knew that cookware is the main problem of village housewives. Rosemary went to deny, but accepted the gift. The hut was clean, cozy, warm. The hostess brewed tea, put a film with lambs, jam, and honey. A quiet morning in the village, peaceful. Julia sipped her tea. She looked at her hostess with bewilderment, remembering something. And I suppose you were bitter. I suppose others had a sweet life? Remember that with wormwood? Julia choked. Rosemary was coughing and crying. You eat it with jam from the freezer. You eat it with jam from the freezer. It'll be less bitter, she said with a sly squint. Julia shuddered. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she jumped up and ran out without looking at anyone. This had never happened before. Nothing disturbed her heart. She had easily done mischief to her sister-in-law. But now a long dormant conscience woke up and troubled her soul. Julia sat on the bench at the gate and could not calm down for a long time. There were no thoughts in her head, only tears flowed unrestrainedly, washing away the blackness that lived in her soul. Nancy's granddaughter was to take away the bitterness of life. A little while later, Julia began to unpack. Then she fiddled in the kitchen until evening, took everything out to the veranda, painted the ceiling and walls, deciding to wallpaper. She just mopped the floors. She had a rug, contrary to village tradition. The old kitchen furniture was falling apart, needing repair. Julia persuaded Dylan to help, who willingly patched the holes. He's a real piece of work. In his 50s and early 50s, he's still got the skill to work with his hands, Julia said with admiration. Dylan laughed at the carpet and told him to paint the floors. You can help me organize the furniture. It's up to me to decide what to do. You city folk are all cuckoo. Linda dismissed him. Oh, for crying out loud. All right, let the carpet be for now, and I'll have the floors repainted later. You'll throw that carpet away in 3 days. Let's see how hot you get at the river. I bought a vacuum cleaner. You've never even heard of it? Dylan gave Linda a friendly look, a playful nudge, a playful look. Oh, Dylan, stop pushing me around. Oh, Dylan, stop pushing me around. We don't have time for that. We have grandchildren to babysit. You didn't let me babysit my former grandchildren, he said bitterly. The son of a border guard, he doesn't show his nose at home. It's been 10 years since we've seen each other. Son, I don't know anything about you. I don't know about anyone. I took care of myself. Only my son is left. After his mother died, he cut off all contact with us. He left, as if he disappeared into thin air. He writes letters once a year. What's wrong with that? He's made his own arrangements. He got an apartment in the Far East. But he didn't have a family, Julia said pityingly and hugged Dylan. He suddenly responded, hugged her and kissed her on the lips. Linda was taken aback. Are you crazy in your old age? You don't know anything. I was in love with you when I was a kid, and Madeline, the town freak, was the first one to jump on me. I don't need any more help from you. I'll see you around, Dylan muttered. He turned and walked away. Right, you're going to teach them a lesson, aren't you? Linda called out to him. What's mine? Wait, you can't talk here. Dylan came up to Julia, kissed her again, and quickly left. She stood in a daze for a minute, then sat down to drink tea in the newly transformed kitchen, sparkling clean. Dylan had hung the chandelier she'd envisioned, installed a floor clock with a pendulum on the wall, adding to the coziness. Only the old set spoiled the overall impression. So the furniture was worth updating. Linda could order new sofas, a wall, an armchair, a bed for her mom. How easy were these things to do now? Why hadn't she thought about Mom's comfort before? For a week, Julia made repairs, ordered furniture. While she waited for delivery, she painted the ceilings and walls. For more than 10 years, she sat on the couch with soap operas, and now she worked, impressing the neighbors, unprecedented for a mature woman's vigor. Her back and arms ached in the evenings. But Julia didn't complain. She endured, glad that God had given her the strength for such an important work. During that week, Dylan visited her more than once, helping with cabinet repairs and rearranging furniture. Julia got used to him, communication became warm, he often stayed late. They remembered the past, made plans. But about Linda's mother, Dylan refused to talk. At parting, he hugged her like his own, but he did not allow himself any liberties, kissing her innocently on the cheek. On the 8th day, the renovation was finished. The old cabinets from the kitchen were dismantled for firewood. For her mother, Julia chose non-tarnished furniture of a pleasant gray shade, which gave the kitchen a new glow. The house sparkled with magical colors with new furniture, fluffy carpets. Julia put all her energies into the renovation and, exhausted of energy, fell asleep on the new sofa. She woke up to a knock on the door. The postmistress Patricia came. The game was dragging on. The family sent a package. Julia opened it anxiously. This time there was no message, just 2 jars with some contents. She opened it carefully, tasted it. Wormwood and the same thing. It's a vicious circle. I chose the right path as a mother a long time ago. I did the repairs. I realized what a despicable thing I'd done to my family. I lost my son. Tell me, haven't we suffered enough? Didn't we? I'm sorry, it's early. It's early, Julia said. Didn't you understand? Came Dylan's voice. Didn't you lock the door? They're going to steal my beauty. Scared you? Linda flinched. The door? Oh, that doesn't make any sense. What didn't I realize? You have to lock the door. That's not what I meant. You just said you didn't get it. Are you all kidding me? Nobody. You did this all yourself. You did all this renovation. If you don't want to tell me, don't tell me. Just go. Don't make a mess. I'm here. We need help with the household chores. My mom asked me to. All right, I'll come back in an hour. Dylan stomped around for a while and came out. Julia made breakfast, working out in her head the problem she'd been given. If Linda knows about her intrigues, Julia has to go through it too. First to feel the bitterness of life, and then there would be hope and a path in the distance. Her granddaughter Svetlova kept saying, and drank the jar of wormwood infusion to the bottom. She choked, took a drink of water, and collapsed without feeling. By evening, Dylan found Julia sleeping soundly in the kitchen. There was no way to wake her. He carried her to the hall and put her on the sofa. Linda looked charming in her sleep. Dylan decided to stay close to her, to wait for her to wake up, so he locked the door. He went into the kitchen. His eye caught a jar of some kind of potion. He sniffed something familiar. He remembered the inscription in the letter he'd recently received. Wormwood. Dylan thought that Julia's mother had continued the punishment, but he wouldn't interfere. Let things run their course. They say Julia herself had been scheming against her daughter-in-law for a year and a half, playing with her fate and her relationship with her son. Dylan turned off the light and lay down on the bed in the bedroom. He fell asleep quickly, a sound, healthy sleep. Julia woke up when there was deep darkness outside the window. She was surprised that she had no memory of the previous day at all. Opening her eyes, Julia squealed with horror. There was a dark silhouette standing on her doorstep. She ran to the bedroom, closed the door, sighed, looked at the bed, and a scream caught in her throat. In the semi-darkness, she saw Linda sitting with her legs overhung. She was pointing her finger, whispering that Julia had ruined her unborn children. Linda fell to her knees. I'm sorry, Linda, the frightened woman pleaded. I pray to God. I'm guilty everywhere, but I don't hold a grudge. An ominous silence was her answer. When Julia looked up in fear, she saw that there was no Linda, but a man sleeping on the bed. She jumped up, a pounding in her temples. Her head was spinning. She listened in silence. It was only when she looked out into the living room that she realized there was no one there. Turning on the bedroom light, Julia breathed a sigh of relief. Dylan, how you frightened me. But he was sleeping soundly as a baby, not awakened by her cries. Turning off the light, Julia went into the kitchen. There was still someone standing at the threshold, a dark silhouette. It walked quickly toward Julia. Dazed with horror, she skidded back into the bedroom, but there stood her mother with an angry expression on her face, moved her whole body, approaching, threatening her with her finger. Why did you have children, you naughty daughter? You've ruined everyone's life. You yourself are wearing silk. You didn't think about your mother. Mommy, don't. I'm sorry, don't swear, I'll fix it. Everything will be different, Julia begged. Her mother had almost reached her and held out her hands. Dylan woke up. He saw Julia staring into the void and whispering in a frantic plea for forgiveness. Julia, what are you doing? She finally saw that there was no one in the room but Dylan. His shout cleared her eyes, but the fear remained. There's someone in the hallway, Julia whispered. You're a mess, Dylan said, shaking his head. You should take less of that stuff. Why did you take wormwood last night? Wormwood doesn't give you visions. It was spiked. That's right. And you knocked over the second bottle, Linda said. Julia flinched. Linda was talking to her. Monkeys, monkeys eat. Linda laughed. Oh my God, I'm imagining things again. Do you have a headache? Impossible, Julia said. Let's go to Mommy. She'll tell you what to do. Take the jar. Julia obediently got ready. She could still hear footsteps in the house. Shadows seemed to lurk in the corners. She fumbled around, grabbing Dylan's arm. Without letting go of him, they came to Rosemary's room. She picked up the jar, took it, and laughed. Well, my dear, how long will you dream of things? A mushroom for a mushroom. That's what you should have called the potion. Rosemary laughed again, but sat the guests down. She fiddled with the herbs and poured some fragrant tea. Here, drink this. It'll make you feel better. You must have a headache, she said to Julia. Thank you. I hope it doesn't make me quite, Julia mumbled. If you don't want to, don't drink and get out of here, Rosemary said sharply. Why are you acting so strangely? You're persecuting me and helping me. Julia, remember the main truth: everything can be forgiven, but guilt in front of an innocent child cannot atone. At home, Dylan gave Julia a lecture. Said that today he would not babysit her. He would come back in the evening. The woman entered the house anxiously, not noticing anything suspicious. Her head ached hardly at all. She felt like going to sleep. Julia fell asleep quickly, barely putting her head on the pillow. She was awakened by her own voice. Hello, daughter. Her mother was sitting on the edge of the couch. Mommy, hello, hello. How I missed you, Julia exclaimed. How beautiful you've made it. Would you have done it before? It was so nice, replied her mother. Mom, I'm sorry, Julia cried, and tried to get up but couldn't. She forcefully crawled on the couch and opened her eyes. The whole pillow was wet. There was no one in the house. I was dreaming, she whispered. But Mom, we'll meet. In fact, I'll change everything. Her head was still heavy, dizzy and aching in her temples. Julia walked to the kitchen, took a jar of jam, tasted it automatically, struggled to do her household chores. Having moved, she decided to cook something tasty, to make pies to treat Dylan in the evening. She had a secret liking for her neighbor Christopher. He was as at ease with her as if he were her own. After an hour, she was surprised to note that her headache was gone and her consciousness was clear. A burst of strength and appetite reminded her that she was quite well. Monkey helped, monkey, because after the tea I had dreams, Julia said. Julia started a new phase of her life and decided to find something to do to keep busy. She used to work for her husband at the prosecutor's office as a secretary. Together with Christopher's father, they had made a fortune and had become respected people in the city. But now Julia realized that no luxury could replace family. The longing for her son, the desire to see her granddaughter and meet her mother had become the main value of her life. It was getting dark. Julia cooked goodies and waited for Dylan to arrive. Then she got angry and decided to go to bed. There was a knock at the door, but instead of a neighbor came a girl who handed Julia an envelope and disappeared. This made Julia angry. She wanted to throw the letter away, but she overpowered herself, sat down and printed the message. There are many roads to redemption, but unfortunately not all of them are peaceful. Julia read aloud. Sounds like a threat. It's my job to scare you, came a man's voice over her ear. Who's there? Julia shrieked in horror and jumped up sharply. Dylan laughed. You're sincerely making fun of me, Julia rebuked him. Did you do it on purpose? I was baking you pies. You're not getting any. Get out of here. I'm an old woman, I have nerves. I have a weak heart. If I don't live to see my son and granddaughter, you'll be responsible for this sin. Just so you know, mark my words. You just cursed me, Dylan grinned. You should close the door. What's the fashion for you to swoop in like a witch? I'll go. Good night, mad woman. Wait. Sit down, eat. Woof. What are you doing? Well, you give me as a dog commands. Julia was outraged. Okay, sorry, I'm kidding. Get your pies. Okay, but don't scare me again. Next time, I'm sure I'll give my soul to God without fail. You've got another 30 years on you, Dylan laughed. What kind of treatment is that? Are there no other words for me? There are. But you'll like them even less, Dylan replied. Shut up. It's scary to imagine what's going on in your head, Dylan said with a sudden change of tone. Then he added with a smirk, you, my love, are like a splinter in my head. Julia choked on her tea and coughed up tears. She wanted to say something. Instead, she sat silently, her eyes wide. You're out of your mind, Dylan grumbled. He hadn't expected such a reaction. He wanted mutual recognition, a warm relationship. He wanted Julia to lower her eyes demurely, take his hand, and tell him that she needed him. An indignant Dylan jumped up and ran outside. Julia straightened up in her chair. She hadn't expected such a reaction from herself. She considered herself a reserved lady. Where did she get this country bumpkin attitude from? Silly, she thought. The next morning, ashamed to remember last night, Julia fulfilled the promise she had made to herself. Before lunch, she went around the city looking for work. Everywhere she was offered only temporary help in the household. Then she resolutely went home and changed her clothes. Redemption is what was needed, she repeated to herself the words of the letter. The first thing Julia did was to stop by Rosemary's house and help her with the vegetable garden. Then she went around to the neighbors to make life easier for the elderly. She didn't take money for her work, and she refused to buy food. It was dark when Julia returned home. Her back ached, but she felt happy. For the first time in days, she felt proud. As she approached the porch, she heard some rustling behind the house. A dark figure. Was she imagining it? Deciding to see what was there, Julia took a few steps and suddenly fell into a hole. She hit her head on something hard and lost consciousness. When she woke up, Julia couldn't tell what time of day it was. It was completely dark. She twisted her head around and tried to get up. When she hit something, she shrieked and felt around, and there were wooden walls everywhere, with planks on top. She was trapped in some kind of box. A cold, sickening feeling of fear and hopelessness scared Julia to death. Help me, help me, help me, help me. She screamed, hysterical. It seemed to her as if an eternity had passed, and at last her body quieted. Her head was splitting with pain. Taking a full breath, Julia calmed down. She remembered the words of the letter, not all paths to redemption are peaceful. This is too much, too much. You can't torture a man like this. You can't, Julia screamed and cried, pounding on the walls of the box. Then she noticed that the lid was sliding open. Julia put her hands and head against it and with an effort opened it. The daylight blinded her eyes, which were unaccustomed to brightness. She blinked, then stood up. Her heart nearly stopped with horror. She was standing in a grave, in a coffin, in a cemetery. Gathering her last strength, Julia began to climb out of the grave. At that time, an inebriated watchman came running to her screams. When he saw someone climbing out of the grave, he almost had a stroke. But he still ran up and managed to push Julia back when she was almost out. Damn zombie. You've got a heart, but you've got an ugly face. Where did your kin put you? Muttered the watchman. Despair seized the unhappy woman, but she guessed to speak calmly. Grandfather, grandfather, she cautiously called the watchman. This is the work of the evil power. Lord, forgive me, sinful, I repent. I swear I won't drink anymore. Grandfather, I'm alive, I fell here. I came to visit my family, and here's this open grave. Grandpa, help me, please. Cunning, pretending to be a human being, said the watchman cautiously. He looked into the grave and saw Julia in black work clothes, with her hair tangled and loose. Help me, you idiot, you damned bastard. Help me out of here. Get me out of here at once. Julia whispered in helplessness, like a hiss. Holy Mother of God, the guard exclaimed fearfully and ran away, making the sign of the cross. Go on, you heartless man. Get out yourself, he said. At the third attempt, Julia got out of the grave. The cemetery was deserted, with a field beyond. A narrow path led somewhere. But where was the village? It was hard to figure out. The paths to redemption are far from peaceful. How did I even end up here? How could anyone do this to a living person? Julia pondered. She sat down by the roadside and began brushing her hair, which seemed to be purposely knotted and tangled in the ominous silence of the cemetery. Thoughts of life and death came into her head. Here is the end of everyone's life, the grave. How much of us is empty, unnecessary, superfluous, and all of us have the same end in a hole under the ground. Lying on the damp earth, Julia thought, as long as I'm alive, I need to think about more than just myself. She didn't cry, she just accepted it. Washed, go down that path over there, as if the road was telling her. Or to a new life one must pass. Maybe this is the path of redemption, not a peaceful one. Mommy, tell me, you're the one who played games with me. How could you do this to me? Julia knew the answer. She had forgotten the way to her mother's house. It was time to return to the place where her soul would be born again. In her mind, she forgave her mother for everything. It was important to go through this redemption, any hardship. It was necessary to beg forgiveness. The path led to the road, but no one passed by. After 15 minutes, Julia was exhausted. She was thirsty. Her legs ached. She sat down on the side of the road to wait for a car. A tractor showed up. By a fateful coincidence, Max was behind the wheel. He agreed to give Julia a ride to the village for a small fee. As she sat down next to him, she breathed a sigh of relief. Then she noticed a familiar backpack at his feet. Julia leaned over and was horrified to see the secret embroidery on the strap, which she herself had custom-made for her son. "Explain at once where you got that from?" she asked sharply, stopping the tractor. "I found this backpack by the roadside, picked it up." "It was a long time ago," Max replied. "I don't remember when. Tell me the truth." Julia slapped the driver. Max did not tolerate it, got out and threw the woman out of the tractor with force, and then drove away. Julia made her way to the village in tears. She was determined to find out about the backpack. The hope of finding her son loomed ahead. His backpack was here, which meant Liam was coming not far away. He and Linda must be messing with me, Julia thought. When she got home, she locked herself in the dark and fell into a heavy, restless sleep. Dylan came to her more than once, but he couldn't get through to her. Julia woke for the first time late in the afternoon. She heated water and washed herself properly. She ate with appetite. Life was coming back to her. The apathy of the last few days had subsided. Julia got dressed and picked up her papers, deciding to go to the police station. "Hello. 5 years ago, my son went to the village of Rodnoy but never returned. Wait. The officers on duty will call the district police officer to you and make a statement with him," Julia was told. An hour later, the woman was invited to the office. "Hello, Kevin. This is the district commissioner." "What do you want to see us about?" the man asked. Julia detailed the events of 5 years ago and described yesterday's incident with the backpack. She was asked to write a statement and promised to look into it. In the evening, she received a phone call and was told to come to the station. They refused to search for her. "No good. Here's a brand new backpack with no embroidery." They searched the house, found nothing, Kevin said, showing the backpack. A clever man figured out what was going on. He got rid of his son's things, burned them in the backyard. Julia got nowhere. The trail went cold, but she didn't take a statement. "Your Liam's missing," the precinct officer said harshly, shooing the woman away. But Julia didn't give up. She decided to turn to Dylan for help. She needed to nail Max to the wall, but the neighbor refused to help. "Are you crazy? Just live in peace. Everything will work itself out." "Don't you understand? That's my son's backpack. I haven't seen him in 5 years. This bastard's obviously up to something. If you don't help me, I'll go to him myself." "You can't stop. And anyway, where were you yesterday? Wandering around the vegetable gardens again?" "Yes, I was helping. Digging underground." Julia didn't want to say anything to scare Dylan. "I'll be honest, it's a great distraction from my darkest thoughts." They stood in the doorway, embracing each other as if they were young, with all the burdens lifted from their shoulders. People who had passed the test, forgiven each other for the present and the past. Dylan and Julia made no secret of their relationship. Rosemary took it calmly, only told them to help with household chores as before. 2 days after the cemetery came a new message. Julia was already waiting for it. She opened it without excitement. It was a postcard with an invitation to visit the vacation home by the river. Dylan took the news calmly. Rosemary sighed mysteriously, smiled imperceptibly. They both knew the landlady of this inn. Julia was waiting for the last test. No matter how much she begged, Dylan refused to go with her and remained adamant. Julia hastily packed, took the invitation card and set off on her journey. It was a short drive, about an hour on a country road. Then the path changed, and it became more difficult to drive in the field. Every now and then the car bounced on the bumps. Finally they arrived. The rest house, which occupied an impressive space, appeared. Several hunting lodges and a 2-story building were located along the river. At the gate, the guard let Julia through without question. Pulling into the grounds, she read the name. In bright red letters on the hull, it read Morocco. 5 years ago, Linda Svetlova found herself on the street because of her mother-in-law's sneaky schemes. The biggest blow was the betrayal of her husband. He did not believe her, did not support her, threw her out as a mean woman. Linda couldn't bear it. Her heart was broken. There was no point in living any longer. Without a shadow of a doubt, she stepped into the road, but a man passing nearby pushed her away a second before the irreparable happened. Linda's head was only slightly bumped, but she was still taken to the hospital. The doctor told the unbelievable news the girl was pregnant. Only this saved Linda from the terrible pain in her heart. She wiped her tears and decided to live against fate. Linda did not want to return to her husband. She could not forgive his betrayal. There was only one way left to her homeland, to her native village. When she returned, she put the house in order and cried for 5 days after being locked up. She had to organize her life for the sake of her child. Linda pulled herself together. She went into town, quit her job at the store. Peggy, Christopher's grandmother, the same Maria Ilinichna, met Linda at the store and told her to tell the truth. They were more than just neighbors. Linda often helped Peggy in the household, came to visit her. The girl became family to this woman. But Julia did not know this and did not see beyond her nose. In the evening, pregnant Linda could not resist and told Peggy for a long time what she had been through for a year and a half. The neighbor cried, unable to believe her own daughter's meanness. Then the old woman took Linda in to help her through this difficult time. The girl got a job in a bakery and managed to help her patroness. When Julia came looking for traces or news, her sister-in-law was in the next room. She was also the one who bribed the villagers to make her mother-in-law think Linda had not returned to the village. Not for a second did the daughter-in-law feel sorry for her mother-in-law. But the news about Christopher alarmed her. She began to search for him. Her first attempts to find her husband proved futile. 7 months later, Linda gave birth to a daughter and named her Madeline. One day, walking on the bank of the river, the girl thought how good it is in the village to rest from the city. After all, it is a very good idea to build a house on the shore, so that the townspeople could rest in it. This thought she shared with Peggy. To Peggy's great surprise, she brought the whole 2 million wrapped in a dish towel. Wow. How did you get so rich? I've been saving. You know, Julia used to give me money like a dog. I couldn't spend it. She didn't set eyes on me for 5 years. Christopher used to come and leave me some money too. I'd save it up. I'd give it to a good cause or a church. I don't need anything myself. Take it. I'm sorry to you. I've been suffering because of my daughter. Thank you, Linda said. It's not just for me, it's for you and a good cause. After consulting a lawyer from the city, Linda got a permit and bought a plot of land by the river. The first house came out small. At first, she didn't think it would be anything worthwhile. She advertised in town and people showed up. They bought places 2 months in advance. A year later, they built 2 two-story buildings and added hunting cabins. The demand did not fall, and the profit grew. For the summer, Linda and her grandmother moved to a cabin built especially for them. All the while, the girl continued her search. She knew that Christopher never came home. He had been expelled from his job because of his long absence. Linda traveled all over the neighborhood in search of her husband. One day, she remembered the God-forsaken village of Red Lion, who lived under the name of William. Scraps recalled the past. Once he easily settled a dispute between the men, reading from the former lines from the laws. After that, the villagers began to go to him for minor matters, to secure their property by law or to formalize the land, to fill out documents. It became clear that more than just a guest was being sheltered. Over time, Christopher grew cold toward his common-law wife. An unknown anxiety overtook his soul. He went to the river all day long, wistfully remembered the same village, grandmother, paintings. The past life was gradually coming back to him. Roberta immediately realized that William began to avoid her. The stern girl packed her things and returned to her mother. Linda did not even think of returning him, he only brought suffering with his indifference. There, in the depths of memories, awoke the feeling of a mysterious girl with a basket of flowers. He saw her in a dream, walking along the road. Then all was cut short by a black cloth. So he was tormented for another 6 months in fragments, remembering the past, trying to find out where he was found. And the next day, without informing anyone of his plans, he got ready to go to the village of Rodno. In the morning he got up early, got on his motorcycle and drove away. Almost 2 years had passed since he had crashed before reaching his destination. Now he knew for sure that this journey had to be completed. That same day, Linda arrived in the village of Krasnoye. She went around 5 yards before they dared to tell her the truth about the accident. Linda was taken to Christopher's house, but no one was there. The villagers waved goodbye and invited her to visit. She could finally tell them who they had taken in. "He's from our village," they said. Christopher pulled onto the road, read the signs, looked around. Then he looked at the cars that occasionally passed by. He instantly refreshed his memories of that fateful day when a tractor had driven into him on this very spot. "Linda," a sharp pain stabbed at his heart. "How could you be without me?" He guessed that the whole misfortune had befallen them only because of his own mother. One planted packet of pills and a fictitious note had ruined entire families' lives. Christopher took a long time to come to his senses, hesitant to continue on his way. He walked between the trees, climbing out of the abyss he'd been living in for the past 2 years. It was like coming out of a coma. Finally, he decided to go to his grandmother to cheer and comfort her. It seemed to him that an eternity had passed. When he reached the doorstep of his grandmother, he ran into the veranda. Toward him, hearing the motorcycle, Peggy ran out. Both were crying and laughing. "Christopher, you're alive, sweetheart. I believed you'd come back, that you were alive," she exclaimed. "Let me look at you. You've grown up so much, and I'm still the same as my grandmother." "Don't cry. It's all right. Everything will be different now," answered Christopher. "And you rascal, how could you torture us for 2 years? Didn't your heart ache? Didn't you feel sorry for your family?" "I just remembered you today. Grandma, where's Linda? Did she come looking for you?" "You don't know anything," Peggy said, and led him into the house. Christopher saw a little girl looking at him with clear blue eyes. "Daughter," he breathed out and choked back bitter tears. "I kicked out my pregnant wife. For 2 years she was alone without me." The girl shook her uncle's hand and ran off to play. She did not immediately get used to strangers, brought up by her mother and grandmother. She was too young to understand the complexities of life. "Where's Linda? Did she go looking for you?" "She's been looking all the time. She went to Red," Peggy said. Christopher shuddered, realizing that he had missed his wife and that fate was confusing them. He decided to wait here for her return and had a long talk with his grandmother. Peggy told him bitterly, "Your mother, Julia, not only Linda, but your other girls were scared away from you, from your son. She once even confessed in a fit of despair how she had separated you from Linda, how she had written that letter in your name, how she wanted to make her infertile." Christopher could hardly believe his mother had arranged such meanness. A lump came to his throat. He shouldn't have believed his wife defending his mother. Because of her, he almost lost the life of his wife and daughter. "Granny, you can't let it go. You can't let it go. You can't. I don't want to see her again. I don't want to know her." Linda returned late that night. As she approached the house, she saw Christopher's motorcycle, burst into tears and rushed into the house. Linda rushed in and threw herself around Christopher's neck because she knew her lover had not betrayed her. Peggy ran to her mother and began beating Christopher with her palms, afraid that her uncle would hurt her mother. They decided to all live together, but they moved into a vacation home that needed owner supervision. Peggy stayed on, promising to move in with her grandson and great-granddaughter later. The vacation home prospered, growing. Christopher's help proved invaluable. With the property properly registered, they expanded and ran the business wisely. Christopher called his daughter Baby and spent all his free time with her. The girl loved her father and became attached to him with all her heart. For 3 more years, Christopher did not want to hear anything about his mother. Time has softened him a little, and he decided to forgive Julia. But only by changing would she be forgiven. Christopher himself devised a plan of redemption. Linda and Peggy did not immediately accept the offer to teach their mother a lesson. It seemed too cruel a way to bring Julia to her senses. "What? Christopher, we've already suffered for 5 years, just like Linda lost you. Julia didn't even spare our future children," said Peggy. "I never drank her poison. It was impossible to drink that stuff. Sometimes the decoction was switched, and sometimes it poured out," Christopher replied. "What did she use? Wormwood. Let her drink the wormwood herself." It was like this. Christopher had been living in the house of Rosemary, a neighbor. When Julia came to the house, the son was in a room a few feet away from his mother. He was glad she was near, alive and well. But changing her character was more important than meeting her. For the time being, Peggy moved into Christopher's house at the recreation center. Christopher wrote a message, changing his handwriting beyond recognition. He wanted his mother to feel a little of what Linda had experienced. It didn't seem enough for him to just confuse her. He invented a whole epic of redemption, remorse, separation from his granddaughter, the bitterness of loneliness. Rosemary also made the frost and wormwood. The wormwood was laced with sleeping pills and hallucinogenic grapes. It seemed unnecessarily extreme. But Christopher persuaded Rosemary's neighbor that there could be no harm. The drugstore had a remedy for the poisoning, which they put in the drink. Christopher came in at night when his mother drank the wormwood concoction, worried about how she was feeling. But it turned out that the son only aggravated the situation, scaring Julia to death. The story of the repairs and help stunned Christopher. It was beyond his plans, but it was a good sign. Julia changed beyond recognition, started dating Dylan. The neighbor was against this punishment, but he couldn't change anyone's mind. Only supported Christopher in her troubles. The hardest step for the son was the story with the cemetery, but one day he cheated death himself, as if born again. He looked at everything with different eyes. He wanted his mother to feel the same way. He made a shallow hole, but forgot to put the shovel away. Julia hit her head, luckily not badly. Christopher gave her a shot with sleeping pills and took her to a pre-prepared hole in the cemetery. There was actually a man to be buried there, so the grave was dug hastily. He had made something that looked like a coffin, more like a box with a lid that could be easily removed from the inside. He had even carefully placed a pillow. Later, Christopher was horrified at what he had done, but remembering that Linda had lived in hell for 1.5 years and had almost lost her child, he calmed his conscience. He waited anxiously for his mother's return. He knew that she would be picked up by the locals on the road and that her lust for life would take its toll. Julia returned in a sorry state and then went to Kevin, the precinct commander. But Kevin knew Christopher's history and was even friends with him, taking advantage of his legal knowledge on occasion. He called Christopher beforehand and asked what to do. That way Julia didn't find out ahead of time that Christopher was alive. Perhaps the son's decision to leave his mother in the dark was too cruel. For 3 years he held a grudge. The only thing he couldn't forgive was Linda. Peggy and Grandma Rosemary softened his heart. They sympathized with him wholeheartedly. Linda and Rosemary wanted to tell Julia several times that Christopher was alive, but they did not dare to interfere. The long-awaited moment had arrived. Julia arrived at their vacation base and walked into the main building. There was no one in the lobby. An Indian tune was playing. She looked around, saw the television, and was taken aback. Pictures of her granddaughter, mother, daughter-in-law, son were changing one after another. "Christopher," she whispered quietly with tears. "Sorry, Mom," came a familiar voice from behind her. Julia turned around, saw Christopher, cried out, and collapsed. She had to call an ambulance. Later, her condition worsened, and Julia was taken to the city clinic. The woman had suffered a stroke. Christopher could not believe what was happening. Instead of a happy reunion and family reunion, he drove his mother to the hospital. Peggy, without a word, packed up and left for her home in Miami. The magical transformation of the dwelling hurt her heart. Everything had already been lovingly arranged. Her daughter Linda had performed a miracle with her own hands. The old mother sat on the new couch, thinking that Julia had recently slept there. "I forgive you, my daughter," she said tearfully. She lay down on the couch and fell asleep. She never woke up again. In the evening, Peggy was visited by Dylan as usual, but it was too late. He broke the sad news to Christopher and Linda. 3 days later, the funeral was held. Half the town was there to say goodbye to Peggy. Christopher and Linda wept uncontrollably. Their daughter Nancy screamed loudly, not understanding why her beloved grandmother was buried in the ground. A week later, Julia was discharged. Still recovering from the blow, she tried to speak, but nothing came out. She could hardly move, mumbled and cried. For the first time, the family lived at Peggy's house. Christopher dropped his mother off, gave her massages, made her exercise, and in the evenings got on his motorcycle and rode off somewhere. He couldn't forgive himself for the anger he harbored toward his mother. Whatever she is, she's still family. He himself is just as bad a person. He himself must walk the path of redemption. His mother's illness and his grandmother's death weighed heavily on Christopher's shoulders. Dylan came to Julia, took her in his arms, put her in the stroller he had bought for her, and they walked together along the river. After 2 months, Julia began to talk and walk on her own. "Dylan, I want to go home," she said. "Where to?" "To the city," Dylan asked. "And son? Granddaughter, are you with me? How can I leave my mother?" "Will you visit?" Julia asked. "We'll get her a helper." Dylan was really attached to Julia. After some thought, he agreed. The next day, while Christopher and Linda were at work, they left for the city. Christopher was informed of the move by Rosemary. She shook her head sternly, and from then on stopped all communication with him. 10 years passed. Young, beautiful Nancy, who was now jokingly called Maria Lovna, graduated from high school and entered teacher training college. Over time, Julia grew stronger, recovered. In the city, she took a rehabilitation course at the best clinic. She and Dylan moved to the country for the summer. They stayed with Christopher and Linda. Rosemary lived in the city with her son for 5 years. She passed away quietly, with God's blessing, buried next to Peggy. We were neighbors, and we still are. The family council decided that Nancy would now live in town like a queen. They entrusted her with Dylan's ancestral apartment. Julia and Dylan sold the house in the village, gathered up their savings and traveled. Too many painful memories were here. Christopher and Linda sold Peggy's house, deciding to leave the village. They bought a condo in Miami, hired a manager for their vacation home base, and moved in. They visited their daughter almost every month until she graduated and got a job in her home village as an elementary school teacher. Julia and Dylan came to visit, to see their granddaughter. They traveled to every city in the United States and then went abroad. Over time, the vacation home passed to Nancy, who stayed true to the land where she was born. Every summer, she came to the cemetery with a basket of peanuts to visit her grandmother.